Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of history's most horrifying medical professions. The Civil War surgeon. Not the kind of doctor with a fancy medical degree and malpractice insurance. I mean the kind where your anesthesia was a bullet to bite down on. Your operating room was a blood-soaked tent that smelled like death's armpit. And your surgeon's main qualification was being able to saw through a femur in under 3 minutes while the patient screamed. These men performed 60,000 amputations during the war. That's 60,000 times someone said, "Yeah, we're taking that leg off. Hold still." So before you drift off, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always 3 a.m. somewhere. And frankly, that's the perfect time for Civil War surgery stories. Now dim those lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft white noise. Get comfortable and try not to think too hard about bone saws. Let's pause for a second and ask ourselves some questions. Have you ever wondered what surgery looked like before doctors washed their hands? Did Civil War surgeons actually know what they were doing? Or were they just confident men with saws who'd read a book once? What happened when a soldier got shot and there were no antibiotics, no x-rays, and no painkillers stronger than whiskey? Would you trust a 23-year-old medical student who learned anatomy by practicing on corpses he wasn't supposed to have? Could you survive an amputation performed in a tent by candlelight while artillery shells exploded overhead? And now, congratulations, you've just woken up in a Union field hospital. The year is 1863. It's the morning after Gettysburg. You can hear screaming from the surgical tent. You can smell something that's definitely gangrene, mixed with chloroform and blood. The man approaching you with a bone saw is smiling because he's been awake for 36 hours straight and might be losing his mind. Good luck. So, you want to be a Civil War surgeon. Let's talk about how someone becomes a Civil War surgeon, because the answer is going to horrify you. In 1861, there was no standardized medical education in America. None. Some medical schools required 2 years of training. Some required 4 months. Some didn't require any previous education at all. If you could pay tuition, you were in. The best medical schools, places like Harvard and the University of Pennsylvania, actually taught anatomy and required students to witness surgeries. The worst medical schools were basically diploma mills run by doctors who needed extra income. You'd sit in lectures, maybe see a cadaver once, take a written exam that you probably couldn't fail, and boom, you're a doctor. Congratulations. Here's your medical degree. Please don't kill anyone. Now add a war into this situation. The Union Army needed doctors immediately. Thousands of them. They weren't picky. If you had a medical degree, even a questionable one, and a pulse, you were hired. Some surgeons had never performed an amputation before their first day in a field hospital. Their first patient was also their first practice. It's like learning to drive by, immediately entering a Formula One race. Except the car is a human leg. And the finish line is, please don't let him die of shock. The application process was simple. You'd write a letter to the Army Medical Board stating that you had a medical degree and wished to serve. You'd travel to Washington or to a regional examination centre. You'd take a brief oral exam where a panel of 3 Army surgeons would ask you basic questions about anatomy and treatment. Can you identify the major blood vessels in the leg? What's your treatment for a gunshot wound? How do you diagnose typhoid fever? If you answered with anything remotely coherent, you passed. The pass rate was about 75%, which sounds reasonable until you realise that means 1 in 4 applicants knew so little about medicine that even the desperate Union Army wouldn't hire them. Once accepted, you were commissioned as an assistant surgeon with the rank of lieutenant. After proving yourself, you might be promoted to full surgeon with the rank of major. Your salary was $115 a month, which was decent money in 1863, assuming you survived long enough to spend it. Then they'd give you orders to report to a regiment, usually within a week. No additional training, no orientation, just go to the 5th Massachusetts Infantry. They're in Virginia. Good luck. You'd arrive at camp and meet the regiment's senior surgeon who was supposed to mentor you. But he was already overwhelmed with his own work, so mostly you'd just watch him operate a few times, then he'd hand you instruments and say, "Your turn." That was your training. Watching someone else cut, then cutting yourself. Like learning surgery through a combination of observation and trial and error, except the errors were fatal. The younger surgeons, and many were very young, early 20s, faced particular challenges. The soldiers didn't trust them. Why would they? You're a 23-year-old kid who looks like he should still be in school, and you're telling a 35-year-old sergeant that you need to remove his arm. He's seen more of life than you've seen of anything. And now, his survival depends on your ability to saw through bone without killing him. The pressure was immense. Some young surgeons rose to the challenge. They learned quickly, developed steady hands and strong stomachs. They discovered they had a talent for working under pressure, for making life or death decisions in seconds. Others crumbled. They'd freeze during surgery. They'd make obvious mistakes. They'd break down and request transfer to non-combat positions. Nobody judged them too harshly because everyone understood this job was impossible. There were also civilian surgeons who volunteered temporarily after major battles. These were established doctors from nearby cities who'd read about Gettysburg or Antietam in the newspaper and felt compelled to help. They'd arrive at field hospitals, work for a week or two until the crisis passed, then return to their comfortable practices. They saw the worst of battlefield medicine, contributed what they could, and left with memories they'd carry forever. Some came back for the next battle. Some never came back, having seen enough horror to last a lifetime. The Confederate Army had even worse problems. They had fewer medical schools in the South to begin with. And as the war dragged on and supplies dwindled, Confederate surgeons were operating with even less equipment and training than their Union counterparts. Some Confederate surgeons were excellent despite these limitations. Others were dangerous and wounded. Confederate soldiers had no choice but to trust whoever was holding the saw. Your medical kit, a saw, some whiskey, and hope. The Civil War surgeon's medical kit was disturbingly simple. Open it up and you'd find bone saws in various sizes, amputation knives, scalpels, forceps, a tourniquet, needles and silk thread for sewing people back together, and maybe some chloroform if you were lucky. That's it. That's the entire toolkit for every type of injury imaginable. No antibiotics, because they haven't been invented yet. No blood transfusions, because nobody understands blood types. No IV fluids, no sterile equipment, because the germ theory of disease is still considered a controversial hypothesis that most doctors think is nonsense. Your saw wasn't even special. It was literally just a carpenter's saw. The same tool you'd use to build a barn, you'd now use to remove someone's arm. Many surgeons just bought their saws from hardware stores. They'd sharpen them between patients if they had time. But if they didn't, well, a dull saw still works. It just takes longer and hurts more. The amputation knife was your most important tool, and it looked exactly like what it was. A large, curved blade designed to slice through muscle as quickly as possible. Speed was everything, because the patient was awake or barely unconscious, and every second mattered. The kit itself was usually contained in a wooden box or leather case, about the size of a modern toolbox. Surgeons carried them everywhere, and the case became as much a part of their identity as their uniform. Some surgeons had their kits custom made, with compartments for each instrument. Others just wrapped everything in cloth and stuffed it in a bag. The fancier kits had velvet lining and brass fittings. The practical ones had stains that told their own stories. Inside, you'd find maybe 3 or 4 different saws. A large capital saw for major amputations, through the thigh or upper arm. A smaller metacarpal saw for fingers and toes. A chainsaw, not the kind with a motor, but literally a flexible chain with teeth that you'd wrap around a bone and pull back and forth like you're flossing a giant tooth. This was useful for amputations in tight spaces where a regular saw wouldn't fit. It was also horrifying to watch in action. The amputation knives came in different sizes too. Large Catlin knives for cutting through thigh muscles, smaller knives for more delicate work. All of them were kept sharp, or they were supposed to be. A sharp knife made cleaner cuts that healed better. A dull knife tore tissue and made everything worse. Surgeons would test their blades before surgery by shaving hair off their own arms. If the knife couldn't shave hair, it needed sharpening. Forceps and clamps were essential for grabbing blood vessels and pulling them out far enough to tie them off. These looked like oversized tweezers with serrated tips that could grip slippery tissue. You'd use them to find the major arteries, the femoral artery in the leg, the brachial artery in the arm, and tie them closed with silk thread. Miss one, and your patient would bleed to death internally, hours after you thought you'd saved them. The tourniquet was just a leather strap or a length of rubber tubing that you'd wrap tight above the amputation site. Some surgeons used the Spanish windlass method, a stick twisted through cloth to tighten it. The goal was to completely cut off blood flow, so the patient didn't bleed out on the table. You'd leave it on during surgery, then release it afterward, to make sure you'd tied off all the vessels properly. If blood came spurting out when you released the tourniquet, you'd scramble to find the vessel you missed and tie it off before the patient died. The needles were large and curved, more like upholstery needles than modern surgical needles. The thread was silk, which was strong and held knots well. You'd sew the skin flap over the stump with large, quick stitches. Neatness didn't matter. Speed and closure mattered. A rough sewing job that kept the wound closed was better than a beautiful one that took too long. And then there was the chloroform, if you had any. It came in a small glass bottle, maybe 3 or 4 ounces. You'd pour it onto a cloth held over the patient's nose and mouth. The bottle never lasted long. After a major battle, chloroform supplies would run out within hours, and then you were back to whiskey and prayer. Some surgeons tried to stretch their supply by using less per patient, but that meant patients waking up mid-surgery, which was its own nightmare. The whiskey served multiple purposes. You could give it to patients before surgery to calm their nerves and dull the pain slightly. You could pour it over wounds as a disinfectant, though nobody was quite sure why this sometimes helped. And you could drink it yourself when the day was done, and you needed to forget what you'd spent the last 12 hours doing. Most surgeons probably used more for that last purpose than the first 2 combined. This was your arsenal against every injury the war could produce. Shattered bones, torn arteries, mangled limbs, abdominal wounds, head trauma, all treated with the same basic tools. It's like trying to fix a car with just a hammer and a screwdriver. Technically possible, but you're going to lose a lot of cars. The recruiting office to the surgical tent, a journey picture. This you're 19 years old. You've never left your hometown in rural Pennsylvania. You've never seen more than 50 people in one place. You sign up to fight because everyone else is doing it, because you believe in the cause, or because they offered you $13 a month, and that sounds like real money. They give you a wool uniform that doesn't fit, a rifle you barely know how to use, and send you off to training camp where you learn to march in formation and shoot at targets. Nobody mentions what happens when you get shot. 3 months later, you're at Gettysburg. It's July 1863, and it's 87 degrees, and you're wearing wool, and you're carrying 40 pounds of equipment, and someone starts shooting at you. A mini-A ball, that's the bullet they used, hits you in the thigh. It's a soft lead bullet, nearly an inch in diameter, and it doesn't just make a clean hole. It tumbles when it hits bone, shattering everything in its path. Your femur explodes into fragments. You fall. The pain is immediate and total. Your friends carry you off the battlefield, because if they don't, you'll die right there. They take you to a field hospital, which is just a tent, or a barn, or sometimes just an open field, with a tarp stretched between trees. The journey from where you fell to the field hospital might be 100 yards, or it might be half a mile. Either way, it's agony. Your friends grab you under the arms and drag you backward while you scream. Every bump sends fresh waves of pain through your shattered leg. You can feel the bone fragments grinding against each other inside your thigh. You can feel blood soaking through your wool pants, warm and sticky. You're leaving a trail behind you like a wounded animal. If you're lucky, an ambulance crew finds you. They load you onto a stretcher, just canvas stretched between 2 poles, and carry you to their wagon. The ambulance is basically a covered cart with no springs and wooden wheels that hit every rock and rut in the road. There are 3 other wounded men in there with you. One is unconscious. One is crying for his mother. One is very quiet, staring at nothing, and you think he might already be dead, but nobody's checked. The ride to the field hospital takes maybe 20 minutes. It feels like hours. Every jolt of the wagon makes you want to die. You're going into shock now. Your body's response to massive trauma and blood loss. You feel cold, even though it's summer. You're shaking uncontrollably. Your vision is narrowing, everything getting dim around the edges. You're coherent enough to be terrified, but not coherent enough to understand what's about to happen to you. The ambulance stops. Hands reach in and pull you out. You're carried into a tent where the heat is unbelievable, and the smell hits you like a physical thing. Blood and chloroform and something else. Something sweet and rotten that you'll later learn is gangrene. You're placed on the ground with dozens of other wounded men. Some are moaning, some are silent. Some are clearly dead, but haven't been moved yet because there's no time. A man walks through, not a surgeon, probably a hospital steward, looking at each wounded soldier for just seconds before moving on. He stops at you, looks at your shattered leg. The bone is protruding through the skin now, white and sharp and wrong. He makes a mark on your forehead with a piece of chalk or charcoal. You don't know what the mark means, but it means something. It means you're Category 1. Immediate surgery required. You wait. Could be 10 minutes. Could be 2 hours. You've lost all sense of time. Other wounded men are carried past you toward the surgical tent. You can hear soaring sounds from inside. You can hear screaming, though some of it might be in your head. A chaplain moves through the wounded, kneeling beside men, offering prayers. He stops at you, asks if you want to pray. You can't form words. He prays anyway. Then it's your turn. 2 men lift you and carry you into the surgical tent. The canvas walls are stained dark. The ground is darker. The surgeon looks exhausted. His apron so blood-soaked it's stiff. He glances at your leg. 1 glance, maybe 2 seconds, and nods. Above the knee, he says to his assistant, not to you. You're just the body containing the leg that needs to come off. They place you on the surgical table. It's just boards, rough wood, still wet from the previous patient. The surgeon's assistant holds a cloth near your face. Breathe deep, he says. The cloth smells chemical and sharp. You breathe because what else can you do? The world starts to spin and fade. Your last coherent thought, before unconsciousness is wondering if you'll wake up, and if you do, what you'll wake up as. 3 months ago, you were in Pennsylvania, learning to march. Now you're about to lose your leg in a tent in southern Pennsylvania, operated on by a man who might have graduated medical school 6 months ago. This is the journey every wounded soldier took, from farm boy to casualty to surgical patient, in the span of a single summer afternoon. The war didn't care about your story, your dreams, or your plans. It just took what it wanted and left you to survive the consequences. The field hospital. Hell with a canvas roof. The field hospital is not a hospital. Let's be clear about that. It's a place where surgeons try to keep you alive long enough to move you to an actual hospital, which might be 20 miles away, which you might not survive the trip to. The field hospital is usually set up a mile or 2 behind the lines, close enough to retrieve the wounded, but far enough that enemy artillery hopefully won't hit it. Hopefully. It's a large tent, or multiple tents, arranged around a central surgical area. The tent flaps are open because it's summer and it's hot and there's no ventilation, and the smell inside is so powerful that even hardened soldiers vomit when they first enter. The smell is blood, obviously. Lots of blood. But also gangrene, which smells like rotting meat mixed with something sweet and nauseating. and chloroform if they're using it, which smells like chemicals and makes your eyes water, and unwashed bodies because nobody's bathed in weeks, and excrement because wounded men can't control their bowels, and death. Death has a smell, and it fills every corner of these tents. Outside the surgical tent, wounded men lie on the ground, waiting their turn. Hundreds of them after a major battle. They are organised by a triage system. Those who will probably die, no matter what, are set aside to die in peace. Those who will probably survive without surgery are told to wait, and those who need immediate surgery are brought in first. The location of a field hospital was chosen based on practical needs, not comfort. You needed water nearby, a stream or creek where you could wash instruments and bloody aprons, though wash is a generous term for rinsing things in cold water that quickly turned red. You needed relatively flat ground for the surgical tent. You needed access to roads for ambulances bringing wounded in and wagons taking them out. And you needed to be visible enough that ambulance drivers could find you in the chaos of battle. Sometimes field hospitals were set up in existing buildings, a farmhouse, a barn, a church, anything with a roof and walls. This was actually worse than tents in some ways. At least tents could be abandoned when they became too contaminated. A church filled with blood and death and amputated limbs. That building was ruined forever. The owners would return after the battle to find their home or barn transformed into something from a nightmare. Floors soaked with blood, walls splattered, the smell so deep into the wood that no amount of scrubbing would ever remove it. Some families just burn their buildings down rather than try to reclaim them. The surgical tent itself was the size of a large room, maybe 20 by 30 feet. In the centre was the operating table, or tables, plural, if the battle was bad enough. Surgeons worked side by side, sometimes so close their elbows bumped. Around the perimeter were rough shelves, holding instruments and supplies, buckets of water, rapidly turning red, basins for collecting amputated tissue, piles of bandages, most of them already used and cleaned by rinsing in cold water. The lighting was terrible. During the day, natural light filtered through canvas, giving everything a yellowish tinge. At night, they used candles or oil lamps, creating wild shadows and making precision work nearly impossible. Surgeons learned to operate by feel as much as by sight. You couldn't see deep into a wound by candlelight, so you'd stick your fingers in and feel for the damaged artery or the bone fragments or whatever you were trying to fix. The noise was constant and overwhelming. Wounded men moaning and crying out, surgeons calling for instruments or assistance, the saw cutting through bone, that distinctive grinding sound that carried across the entire hospital area, the thud of amputated limbs being tossed into the corner, chaplains praying, stewards shouting updates about new wounded arriving, and underneath it all, the distant thunder of artillery, reminding everyone that the battle was still happening, and more casualties were coming. The ground around the surgical tent was chaos. Discarded equipment everywhere. Bloody bandages piled in heaps. Puddles of diluted blood where water had been thrown out. And the men themselves, hundreds of wounded soldiers in various states of trauma, waiting their turn or recovering from surgery or dying quietly, while everyone else was too busy to notice. Staff moved through this chaos with practiced efficiency. or at least they tried to. Hospital stewards organised the flow of patients. Ambulance crews delivered new wounded and carried away those who'd been treated. Chaplains provided spiritual comfort. A few nurses, both male and female, offered what care they could. Water for the thirsty, blankets for those in shock, hands to hold for the dying. After a major battle, a field hospital might operate continuously for 3 days. Surgeons worked in shifts, though shifts is misleading because there was no real break. You'd operate until you physically couldn't anymore. Then sleep for a few hours in a corner somewhere, then wake up and operate again. The stream of wounded never stopped. As soon as you finish one surgery, the next patient was already on the table. And when the battle finally ended and the last surgery was performed, the field hospital would be abandoned. The army would move on, following the war. The tents would be struck, the supplies packed. What remained was a contaminated patch of ground, the pile of amputated limbs, and whatever wounded men were stable enough to be moved to general hospitals farther from the front. This temporary hell would disappear almost as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only scars on the land and in the memories of everyone who'd been there. Triage. Who lives? Who dies? Who waits? The surgeon walks among the wounded, making decisions faster than you can think. This one, bring him in now. That one, he'll keep for a few hours. That one over there with his intestines exposed, make him comfortable. There's nothing we can do, it's brutal mathematics. The surgeon has to calculate. How many men can I save? How much time do I have? How many will die during surgery versus die from waiting? How many will survive surgery but die from infection anyway? At Gettysburg, there were roughly 21,000 wounded Union soldiers. The medical corps had maybe 100 surgeons working around the clock. Do the math. Each surgeon had to treat 200 plus patients, even working non-stop for 72 hours. That's less than an hour per patient, including surgery, recovery monitoring, and moving to the next one. In reality, most amputations took 10 to 15 minutes. The fastest surgeons could do it in 3. But then you had to move the patient, clean the table, actually scratch that, nobody cleaned the table, then prep the next patient, then operate again, and again, and again, until your hands cramped and your back ached, and you couldn't remember the last time you slept or ate or sat down. Some surgeons performed 40 amputations in a single day, 40 separate human beings, each one screaming or unconscious or praying or cursing, each one trusting you to save their life. The triage system wasn't invented during the Civil War, but it was perfected there out of pure necessity. A French surgeon named Dominique Jean Larrey had developed it during the Napoleonic Wars, but American surgeons had to relearn it the hard way, one overwhelming battle at a time. The basic principle was simple. Divide the wounded into categories, based on survivability and urgency, but actually doing it. That required a kind of cold pragmatism that most civilian doctors had never needed. Category 1, immediate surgery required, good chance of survival. These were your limb injuries with shattered bones, major wounds that needed amputation or debridement right now. These men got taken to the surgical tent first. They were the ones you could actually save if you moved fast enough. Category 2, serious injuries but can wait a few hours. Maybe a fracture that needed setting but wasn't life-threatening. Maybe a flesh wound that needed cleaning but wasn't bleeding badly. These men were told to wait, given water if available, and basically left to suffer, while Category 1 patients got treatment. Some Category 2 patients would deteriorate into Category 1 while waiting. Some would improve enough that they'd be stable for transport. It was a gamble. Category 3, minor injuries that would heal on their own or with minimal intervention. A bullet through the shoulder muscle that missed bone and major vessels. A superficial head wound that bled dramatically but wasn't actually dangerous. These men were patched up quickly with a bandage and sent away to make room for worse cases. They'd get proper treatment later at a general hospital if they survived that long. And then there was the unspoken category, the ones who were going to die no matter what you did. Abdominal wounds where intestines were perforated, chest wounds with sucking sounds that meant punctured lungs, head wounds where you could see brain tissue, massive blood loss with already fading pulses. The surgeon would mark these men, sometimes with a piece of charcoal on the forehead, sometimes with just a shake of his head to the stewards, and they'd be moved aside, given morphine if any was available, covered with a blanket, left to die as comfortably as possible, while resources went to men who had a chance. This last category was the hardest part of triage. You're essentially deciding that this human being isn't worth your time, because saving him would cost too much effort that could save 2 or 3 other men instead. It's pure utilitarian ethics applied to bleeding soldiers who are begging you for help. Some surgeons couldn't do it. They tried to save everyone, spending an hour on a hopeless abdominal wound, while 3 men with survivable limb injuries bled out waiting for their turn. These surgeons had to be relieved of triage duty because their compassion was literally killing people. The best triage surgeons developed an almost supernatural ability to assess injuries in seconds. They'd look at a wound, check pulse and breathing, maybe ask the patient a question or two, and make their decision. 10 seconds per patient, maybe 15. They were right about 80% of the time, which meant 20% of their decisions were wrong. Some men they marked for immediate surgery died anyway. Some men they marked as hopeless survived. You learned to live with this, or you broke down. The psychological toll was immense. You're walking through rows of wounded men, and they're all looking at you with desperate hope. They think you're going to save them, and you're making calculations about who's worth saving and who isn't based on injuries you're assessing in the time it takes to tie your shoe. Some wounded men would beg, "Please, doctor, I have children. Don't leave me here, I can make it." The surgeon would nod sympathetically, mark them for the dying category anyway, and move on, because begging doesn't change anatomy, and desperate hope doesn't reattach severed arteries. After major battles, surgeons would sometimes discover they'd triaged over 1,000 men in a single day. 1,000 life or death decisions, made in seconds each. Most surgeons tried not to think about it. They'd focus on the ones they saved, rather than the ones they couldn't. But late at night, in the quiet moments between shifts, some surgeons would break down, wondering if they'd made the right calls, wondering if the boy they'd marked as hopeless might have survived with surgery, wondering if the man they'd operated on for an hour was really worth saving compared to the 3 who died waiting. This was triage In the Civil War, mathematics applied to mortality, logistics applied to human suffering, and the crushing weight of playing God with incomplete information and no time to second guess yourself. Anesthesia, the knockout juice, if you're lucky. Let's talk about anesthesia, because this is where things get interesting. Chloroform and ether existed during the Civil War. They'd been discovered in the 1840s, and by 1863, most army surgeons had access to them. This was revolutionary. For all of human history before this, surgery meant being awake and feeling everything. Now suddenly you could be unconscious. The problem was that anesthesia was tricky. Too little and you're awake and screaming. Too much and you stop breathing and die. There was no precise way to measure dosage. The anesthesiologist, usually just a medical assistant or sometimes a random soldier, pressed into service, would pour chloroform or ether onto a cloth, hold it over your nose and mouth, and watch you carefully. When you stop moving, they'd pull the cloth away. If you started moving again during surgery, they'd reapply it. It was guess and check medicine, performed on humans. Some surgeons didn't trust anesthesia. They thought it was dangerous, which it was. They thought pain actually helped patients survive because it kept them conscious and fighting. This was wrong, but nobody knew that yet, so some surgeons just didn't use it. They'd hand you a bullet to bite down on, tie you to the table, and start cutting. The phrase "bite the bullet" comes from this, by the way. It's not metaphorical. You literally bit down on a lead bullet while someone sawed your leg off. You bit down so hard your teeth would leave marks in the soft lead. Chloroform was preferred over ether for practical reasons. Ether took longer to work, maybe 5 to 10 minutes, to achieve unconsciousness. Chloroform worked in about 2 minutes. When you're processing 40 patients a day, those 3 to 8 minutes per patient add up fast. Chloroform also didn't irritate the lungs as much as ether, which could cause coughing and gagging that made surgery difficult. And chloroform came in smaller bottles that were easier to transport. In a field hospital and where every ounce mattered, this was significant. But chloroform had a nasty quirk. It could kill your heart. Sudden cardiac death was rare, but not unheard of. The patient would be breathing normally, unconscious, everything fine. Then their heart would just stop. No warning. No way to restart it, because CPR wouldn't be invented for another century. The surgeon would be mid-amputation and suddenly realise his patient was dead. This happened often enough that surgeons developed a healthy fear of chloroform, even while relying on it. The administration technique was primitive by modern standards. The anaesthetist would fold a cloth, usually a handkerchief or piece of lint, into a cone shape. They'd pour a small amount of chloroform or ether onto the cloth, maybe half an ounce. Then they'd hold it over the patient's nose and mouth, close enough that they'd inhale the vapours, but not so close that the liquid touched their skin, which could cause chemical burns. The patient would breathe normally at first. Then the anaesthetic would start working. Their breathing would slow and deepen. Their eyes would flutter. They'd often fight it in the beginning, turning their head away or trying to push the cloth aside. The anaesthetist would have to hold them still, keeping the cloth in place. After a minute or two, the patient would go limp. This was the dangerous moment. Too little anaesthetic and they'd wake up mid-surgery. Too much and they'd stop breathing altogether. The anaesthetist would watch for signs. Is the chest rising and falling regularly? Are the eyelids still twitching? Is the pulse strong and steady? These were your only indicators because monitoring equipment didn't exist. No blood pressure cuff, no pulse oximeter, no heart rate monitor, just your eyes and your fingers on their wrist, feeling for a pulse that could disappear without warning. During surgery, the anaesthetist had to stay focused on the patient's face, watching for any sign of consciousness returning. A grimace, a moan, movement. At the first indication, they'd reapply the chloroform-soaked cloth. But not too much, because remember, too much stops the heart. It was a constant balancing act between too little and too much, with no precise measurements available. Supply was another issue. After major battles, chloroform ran out fast. A typical field hospital might go through dozens of bottles in a single day. When supplies were exhausted, surgeons had no choice but to operate without anesthesia. They'd tell the patient honestly, "We're out. This is going to hurt. Scream if you need to. Everyone else does." The patients who underwent surgery without anesthesia had to be physically restrained. Strong soldiers would hold down the patient's arms and legs while the surgeon worked. The patient would thrash and scream and sometimes pass out from shock, which was actually helpful because unconscious patients don't move. But many stayed conscious throughout, experiencing every cut and every stroke of the saw in full clarity. These men often wished they'd died on the battlefield instead. Some patients refused anesthesia even when it was available. They didn't trust it. They'd heard stories of men dying under chloroform. They'd rather endure the pain than risk never waking up. Surgeons would try to convince them otherwise, but ultimately it was the patient's choice. So some men went through amputation fully awake, by their own decision, gripping the edges of the surgical table, biting down on leather straps or bullets, enduring what the human body was never meant to endure. The irony is that anesthesia was one of the genuine medical advances of the Civil War era. For the first time in history, major surgery didn't have to be a torture session, but the technology was so primitive and supplies so limited that many soldiers never benefited from it. They experienced surgery the way humans had for thousands of years, in full, conscious agony, praying for it to end quickly. The surgical table, a door on two barrels. The surgical table in a field hospital was often literally a door removed from its hinges and placed across two barrels. Sometimes it was just boards nailed together. Sometimes it was nothing. The patient just lay on the ground. There was no padding, no pillow, no comfort of any kind. You lay on bare wood in your filthy, blood-soaked uniform because there was no time to undress you properly. The surgeon would cut away the clothing around your wound with the same knife he was about to use for surgery. Underneath the table, the ground was dark with blood. After a long day of surgery, blood pooled so deep that surgeons stood in it ankle deep. It soaked into their boots and their pant legs. It mixed with the dirt floor and created a paste that stuck to everything. In the corner of the tent, there was usually a pile. We need to talk about the pile. After each amputation, the severed limb was tossed aside. By the end of a battle, after hundreds of surgeries, there would be a heap of arms and legs, some still in their boots or sleeves, just piled in the corner, like cordwood. Sometimes the pile was inside the tent, sometimes it was outside. Soldiers walking past would see it and understand immediately where they were. The pile grew throughout the day. After dark, someone, usually assigned soldiers who'd lost the lottery of duty assignments, would cart the limbs away and bury them in a mass grave. The table itself was maybe 6 feet long and 2 to 3 feet wide, just big enough for a human body. The height was whatever the barrels or supports made it, usually waist high for the surgeon, so he didn't have to bend too much during long operations. Ergonomics weren't really considered, but surgeons quickly learned that table height mattered when you were operating for 12 hours straight. The surface was never cleaned between patients. There wasn't time. A steward might wipe it with a damp cloth if things were slow, but slow never happened during major battles. Instead, each new patient was just laid down on top of the blood and tissue from the previous patient. Your back would press into the still warm blood of whoever had been there before you. You could feel it soaking through your uniform. Some patients noticed this even through their shock and fear. Most were too far gone to care. The surgeons stood beside the table, usually on the side of the injury. An assistant stood opposite, helping to hold the patient still and handing instruments. When needed, if anesthesia was being used, the anaesthetist stood at the head of the table with their chloroform-soaked cloth. If no anesthesia was available, you'd have 2 or 3 strong soldiers holding the patient down, because conscious patients fought like their lives depended on it, which they did. The lighting situation was absurd by modern standards. During daylight, the canvas tent filtered sunlight into a dim yellowish glow that made precision work difficult. You couldn't see deep into wounds clearly. Blood looked darker than it was. Shadows, obscured details. Surgeons learned to work partially by feel, their fingers exploring wounds that their eyes couldn't fully see. At night, it's got worse. Oil lamps or candles provided the only light, and they created dramatic shadows that shifted every time someone moved. Imagine trying to tie off an artery by candlelight while the flame flickers and your shadow dances across the surgical field. Now imagine doing this while exhausted and covered in blood, with another 30 patients waiting outside. Surgeons developed almost supernatural hand-eye coordination just to survive these conditions. The pile in the corner deserves more attention because it haunted everyone who saw it. After an amputation, the surgeon or his assistant would toss the severed limb aside without ceremony. No time for reverence, no time for burial, just toss it and move to the next patient. The limbs would land in a heap, and the heap would grow. Arms still in uniform sleeves, hands clenched or relaxed, depending on how the muscles had contracted. Legs still in boots and pants, some with the foot still inside the boot at an unnatural angle. By afternoon, the pile might be 3 feet high. By evening, higher. The smell was distinct. Fresh blood, exposed bone, and the beginning of our decomposition in summer heat. Soldiers walking past the surgical tent would stop and stare at the pile. Some would look for recognisable boots or uniform details, wondering if that leg belonged to their friend from the same company. Some would turn away immediately, unable to process what they were seeing. Some would vomit. The pile was proof of what was happening inside the tent. More visceral than any description. Flies discovered the pile quickly. By afternoon, it would be swarming with them. The buzzing was loud enough to hear from yards away. The flies would then move into the surgical tent, landing on everything, spreading contamination from the pile to open wounds. Nobody could stop them. Shooing flies away was pointless when there were thousands of them, and you were busy trying to save lives. At night, after the last surgery was finished, or at least paused, someone had to deal with the pile. This job usually fell to enlisted men on punishment detail, or just whoever was unlucky enough to be nearby when the order was given. They'd shovel the limbs into carts or wagons, trying not to think about what they were touching. The limbs would be buried in trenches, dug specifically for this purpose, usually far enough from the hospital that the smell wouldn't carry back. Sometimes families would come looking for their soldier's amputated limb, wanting to bury it properly, or keep it as a memorial. By then, it was long buried in an unmarked mass grave with hundreds of others. There was no tracking system, no way to identify which leg belonged to which soldier. Once it went in the pile, it was anonymous. The surgical table and the pile together represented the industrial nature of Civil War medicine. This wasn't careful, individualised care. This was mass processing of wounded bodies, efficient and brutal, and completely overwhelming. The table was the assembly line. The pile was the waste product. And the surgeons were the workers trying desperately to keep the line moving while maintaining some shred of humanity in a fundamentally inhumane situation. The amputation, speed over precision. Here's how an amputation worked in 1863. The surgeon would tie a tourniquet above your wound, cutting off blood flow. This was essential because you only had about 5 pints of blood in your body, and losing 2 of them meant death. The tourniquet kept you from bleeding out during surgery. Then the surgeon would make a circular cut through your skin and muscle, about 2 inches above where the bone needed to be severed. He'd cut down to the bone with a long-bladed amputation knife, slicing through all the muscle in one smooth motion. Speed was critical here. The faster he cut, the less you bled, and the less time you spent in agony. Once he reached bone, he'd pull the muscle and skin upward, exposing the bone beneath. Then came the saw. The bone saw had large teeth, designed to cut through a hard material quickly. The surgeon would brace the saw against your bone and make long, rapid strokes. The sound was distinctive, a wet, grinding noise that everyone in the tent could hear. It took anywhere from 30 seconds to 2 minutes to saw through a major bone, like a femur. Once the limb was severed, it was tossed aside. The surgeon would then tie off the major blood vessels with silk thread to prevent bleeding. This part required some skill, because if he missed a vessel, you'd hemorrhage internally and die within hours. Finally, he'd pull the skin flap down over the stump and sew it closed. The entire procedure, from first cut to final stitch, took 10 to 15 minutes if the surgeon was competent. 3 minutes if he was both competent and desperate. The tourniquet was applied with significant force. You wanted complete blood flow stoppage, which meant tightening it until the limb below turned pale and cold. The patient would feel intense pressure and pain from the tourniquet itself, separate from the injury. Some surgeons used a stick twisted through the tourniquet strap, the Spanish windlass method, to achieve maximum tightness. Others just pulled as hard as they could and tied it off. Either way, the tissue below the tourniquet was basically dying from lack of oxygen. This added urgency to the operation because you couldn't leave it on indefinitely without causing additional damage. The initial circular cut was called the retraction cut, and it required confidence and a steady hand. The surgeon would grip his amputation knife like he meant it and slice through skin, fat and muscle in one continuous motion, rotating around the limb. If he hesitated or made multiple shallow cuts, the bleeding would be worse and the tissue would be mangled. One deep, decisive cut was the goal. The knife blade was curved specifically for this purpose, designed to follow the contour of the limb, while cutting at a consistent depth. Blood would start flowing immediately, despite the tourniquet, because smaller vessels weren't completely compressed. The surgeon's assistant would use cloths to dab away blood, so the surgeon could see what he was doing. Sponging, they called it, though these weren't clean surgical sponges. They were just rags, often already used on previous patients, wrung out in a bucket of water that turned progressively redder throughout the day. Once the muscle was cut, the surgeon would retract it upward, pulling the skin and muscle away from the bone, like rolling up a sleeve. This created a flap of tissue that would eventually be folded down over the stump. But first you had to remove the bone beneath. An assistant would hold the retracted tissue up and out of the way while the surgeon positioned his saw. The sawing motion was long and powerful, using the full length of the blade. Short, rapid strokes didn't work well. You'd generate heat from friction and dull the blade without making much progress. The surgeon would brace one hand on the limb for stability and use the other to pull the saw back and forth with as much force as he could muster. The physical effort was significant. After 40 amputations in a day, surgeons' arms would be shaking from exhaustion. The sound of the saw cutting bone was unforgettable. A grinding, scraping noise mixed with the wet sound of cutting through tissue. Bone dust and blood would spray slightly with each stroke. The smell of cut bone was distinct, minerally and sharp, completely different from the smell of blood. Patients who were conscious or semi-conscious would hear and feel this happening to their own body. The vibration travelled through their bones. Many patients reported that the sawing was worse than the cutting, psychologically, if not physically. When the bone was severed, the limb would come free suddenly. The surgeon would hand it to an assistant or just drop it aside, not looking at it. No time for contemplation. Immediately, he'd turn his attention to the bleeding vessels. The major arteries and veins would be spurting or oozing blood, despite the tourniquet. He'd use forceps to grab each vessel, pull it out from the surrounding tissue. This required a delicate touch, because vessels are slippery and fragile, and tie it off with silk thread. This was the part where skill really mattered. Miss a vessel, and the patient would bleed internally after surgery, dying hours or days later from blood loss you couldn't see or stop. Tie the thread too tight, and the vessel would tear, making it harder to secure. Too loose, and the knot would slip, with the same fatal result. Surgeons had to identify and ligate, sometimes a dozen vessels, in a major amputation, working quickly but carefully. A combination that required both experience and natural talent. The final step was closing the wound. The surgeon would release some tension on the tourniquet to verify that the vessels were properly tied. If blood spurted out, he'd have to find and tie the missed vessel. Then he'd pull the skin flap down over the exposed bone end and stitch it closed with large, quick sutures. The stitching didn't have to be pretty. It had to be functional. Neat stitches took time you didn't have. And anyway, the wound would probably get infected, regardless of how carefully you closed it. Total time, 10 to 15 minutes on average. The fastest recorded amputations took under 3 minutes from first cut to final stitch. These speed records were a source of pride among surgeons, but they came with a cost. Faster operations meant less precision, higher chances of missed vessels, and rougher closures. But they also meant less time in agony for the patient and more patients treated per day. In battlefield medicine, speed saved lives through volume, even if individual surgical quality suffered. The bone saw, your friendly neighbourhood. Nightmare. Let's focus on the saw for a moment, because it deserves special attention. The capital saw, as it was officially called, was 12 to 16 inches long, with coarse teeth. It had a wooden handle and a slightly curved blade. It was designed for speed, not precision. When a surgeon used one, he'd place it against bone and make long, powerful strokes, 10 to 20 strokes, to get through a femur. Fewer for a smaller bone, like a radius or fibula. The saw blade would heat up from friction. Blood and bone fragments would spray with each stroke. The surgeon's hand would slip if he wasn't careful, potentially cutting himself or the patient, worse than intended. Many surgeons wrapped the handle with cloth to improve grip. Some saws had teeth on both edges, so you could use either side. This was useful when one edge got too dull or clogged with bone fragments. After surgery, the saw was supposed to be cleaned. Supposed to be. In reality, during long battles, surgeons just wiped them on their aprons and used them again. The apron, by the way, was usually leather and was never washed. It was a badge of honour. The bloodier your apron, the more surgeries you'd performed. Surgeons would wear the same apron for months, accumulating layers of dry blood until it was stiff and dark. They thought this looked professional. It demonstrated experience. The teeth on a capital saw were large and aggressive, maybe a 1/4 inch between each tooth. They needed to be large to cut quickly through dense bone without binding. The cutting action wasn't smooth. It was violent and jagged, tearing through bone fibre rather than slicing cleanly. Modern surgical saws are designed to minimise trauma to surrounding tissue. Civil War saws were designed to get through bone before the patient died of shock. Subtle difference. The handle was critical because your grip determined everything. Lose your grip mid-stroke, and the saw could skid across bone, cutting into muscle you were trying to preserve, or worse, cutting your own hand. Surgeons learned to grip hard, using their whole hand, keeping their fingers away from the blade. The handle would get slippery with blood, which is why many wrapped it with strips of cloth or leather. Some surgeons carved grooves into the wooden handle to improve grip. Others just developed calluses, and held on tighter. The curved blade served a purpose. When sawing through a cylindrical bone, like a femur, the curve allowed the blade to follow the bone's contour more naturally than a straight blade would. This reduced the chance of the saw jumping or binding, but it also meant you had to angle your strokes carefully. Saw straight down, and you'd bind the blade. Saw at the right angle, and it would cut smoothly. This was learned through practice, and the first few amputations every new surgeon performed were lessons in how not to use a saw. The friction heat was significant. After several strokes, the blade would be noticeably warm to the touch. The bone itself would heat up too, and you could smell it. A burnt, acrid odour mixed with blood. Surgeons learned to work through this. You couldn't stop to let the saw cool. You just kept sawing, accepting that you were essentially creating a hot blade cutting through living tissue. The heat probably caused additional tissue damage, but nobody knew that at the time. Bone fragments were a constant problem. As you sawed, tiny pieces of bone would break off and get caught in the saw teeth. This reduced cutting efficiency and required more force to continue. Some surgeons would pause briefly to clear the teeth with their fingers or a cloth. Others just powered through, letting the fragments accumulate until the saw was basically pushing bone paste rather than cutting cleanly. After particularly difficult amputations, the saw would be so clogged with bone matter that it needed to be scraped clean before the next use. The double-edged saws were practical innovations, born from necessity. If one edge got too dull or damaged, you could flip the saw and use the other edge without having to sharpen or replace the blade. During long surgical sessions, this saved valuable time. The downside was that double-edged saws were more dangerous to handle. Every surface was sharp, which made storage and cleaning trickier and increased the risk of accidental cuts. Maintenance was supposed to include regular sharpening and cleaning. Proper care would have meant cleaning after each use, sharpening before each surgery, and replacing blades that were damaged or too worn. In reality, saws were used until they literally couldn't cut anymore. Then they were sharpened poorly with whatever file or stone was available, then used again. Some surgeons went through entire battles with saws that were progressively getting duller, requiring more strokes and more effort for each amputation. The famous blood-crusted surgical apron deserves its own acknowledgement. These were thick leather aprons that hung from the neck down to the knees, protecting the surgeon's uniform underneath. They started out tan or brown. After weeks or months of use, they turned dark, reddish black, stiff from accumulated dried blood. Modern doctors would be horrified, but Civil War surgeons genuinely believed this was a mark of experience. A pristine white apron meant you were new and inexperienced. A crusty, blood-stained apron that could practically stand up on its own meant you'd saved lives, or at least attempted to. The aprons were never washed, because nobody saw the point. They'd get bloody again immediately. So why waste time and water cleaning them? This reasoning made sense in a world where germs weren't understood, and sanitation was barely considered. The apron was a tool like the saw. You used it until it wore out. Then you got a new one. The old one might be kept as a souvenir, or just thrown away, carrying with it the blood of hundreds of soldiers, whose names the surgeon had forgotten. but whose screams he'd remember forever. The saw itself often became a keepsake after the war. Surgeons would keep their capital saws as reminders of their service. Some were passed down to children or donated to medical museums. These artefacts still exist today in collections, the wood handles worn smooth from use, the blades still bearing traces of rust that might once have been blood, silent witnesses to the thousands of amputations they performed. Pain management, whiskey, morphine, and prayer. If you were lucky enough to get anesthesia, you'd be unconscious during surgery. If you weren't, you'd experience pain beyond anything you can imagine. The human body has limits to pain perception, but Civil War surgery found those limits and crossed them enthusiastically. For pain after surgery, the options were limited. Whiskey was common. Morphine was available, but carefully rationed because supplies were limited and the army needed it for the worst cases. Opium-based painkillers existed, laudanum, morphine pills, but there wasn't enough to go around. Many soldiers received nothing at all, just bandages and best wishes. The pain after an amputation was described as burning, throbbing, crushing agony that never stopped. Your nerves were severed, but still firing, sending confused signals to your brain. Phantom limb pain was common. You'd feel intense pain in the foot and or hand that was no longer there. Nobody understood why this happened, so it was dismissed as hysteria or weakness. Some soldiers begged to die. Some tried to die, refusing food and water until they got their wish. Some survived through sheer spite, determined to prove they were tougher than the injury. And some, a lucky few, seemed to feel less pain than others. Pain tolerance varies wildly between individuals, and some Civil War soldiers apparently had a supernatural ability to endure suffering. Whiskey was the most available pain management tool because the army had lots of it. Not for pain management, for morale, but surgeons quickly repurposed it for medical use. A soldier about to undergo surgery without anesthesia would be given a full tin cup of whiskey, told to drink it all quickly, then given another. The goal was to get them as drunk as possible before cutting started. Did this actually help with pain? Marginally. Alcohol dulls sensation somewhat and definitely makes you care less about what's happening to you. But it doesn't come close to actual anesthesia. You're still awake, still feeling everything, just drunk while it happens. Which sounds worse when you think about it. Experiencing the worst pain of your life while also being unable to think clearly. Morphine was a different story. Morphine actually worked. It was derived from opium and had been isolated into its pure form in the early 1800s. By the Civil War, it was available in both liquid form and as pills. A standard dose was about a quarter grain, administered either orally or by injection under the skin. The hypodermic syringe had been invented just before the war, making subcutaneous injection possible for the first time. This was revolutionary because morphine worked faster and more effectively when injected than when swallowed. The problem was supply. The Union Army had access to morphine through established pharmaceutical companies in the North. The Confederacy had less access as the war progressed, and Union blockades cut off imports. By 1863, Confederate surgeons were running out of morphine entirely and had to resort to cruder opium preparations, or nothing at all. Even in the Union Army, Morphine was rationed. You didn't get it for minor pain. You got it if you were dying, or if your pain was so severe that you were screaming uncontrollably and disturbing other patients. Cold but practical. Laudanum was liquid opium dissolved in alcohol. It was less potent than pure morphine, but more widely available. A spoonful of laudanum would take the edge off pain without completely eliminating it. Many soldiers developed addictions to laudanum during their recovery, continuing to use it long after their injuries healed. This wasn't considered a major problem at the time, because opium addiction wasn't well understood or particularly stigmatised. If it helped you function, you kept taking it. The phantom limb phenomenon was one of the most disturbing aspects of amputation recovery. Soldiers would wake up after surgery and swear they could still feel their missing leg or arm. Not just feel it, feel pain in it. Intense, burning pain in a foot that was buried in a mass grave 100 yards away. They'd look down at their stump, see nothing there, but the pain in the phantom limb was as real as anything they'd ever felt. Surgeons had no explanation. Some thought it was psychological trauma. Others thought patients were faking for attention or extra morphine. In reality, it was nerve damage, creating false signals. But neuroscience wouldn't understand this for another century. Soldiers coped in different ways. Some found that focusing on the phantom limb, trying to move it mentally, would sometimes reduce the pain. Others discovered that touching or massaging the stump would help. Most just suffered through it, adding phantom limb pain to the list of things they had to endure on top of the actual surgical wound, the infection risk, the fever, and the crushing realisation that they'd lost a limb permanently. The psychological component of pain was significant. Soldiers who had strong reasons to live, families waiting, unfinished business, religious faith, seemed to tolerate pain better than those who'd lost hope. This wasn't just stoicism. There's actual neurological basis for psychological state affecting pain perception. But Civil War doctors didn't know this. They just noticed that some men screamed and some men gritted their teeth silently, and they had no idea why. Prayer was offered as pain management by chaplains who moved through the recovery tents. From a medical standpoint, prayer doesn't reduce pain. From a psychological standpoint, it absolutely can. Having someone sit with you, hold your hand, tell you God has a plan, this provides comfort that translates into better pain tolerance. Chaplains became de facto pain management specialists, not through medical training, but through simple human compassion. They'd sit with dying men for hours, praying continuously, and the men would often visibly relax. Was this divine intervention or psychology? It doesn't really matter to the patient. If it helped, it helped. The soldiers who refused food and water, trying to die, were more common than official records suggest. This wasn't counted as suicide because they were technically dying from their wounds, just faster. Medical staff would try to convince them to eat, to drink, to fight. Some could be convinced, others couldn't. They'd made their decision. Living without a leg, facing poverty and disability, enduring endless pain wasn't worth it. They'd rather just go. And sometimes the medical staff would quietly let them. Not officially, not openly, but they'd stop pushing water and food on someone who'd clearly decided. Mercy took many forms. in Civil War hospitals. Infection, the invisible killer. Here's the thing that killed most Civil War soldiers. Infection. Not the bullet, not the surgery. The infection that came after. Why? Because nobody washed their hands. Nobody. Louis Pasteur had published his germ theory in 1861, but most American doctors hadn't heard of it or didn't believe it. The prevailing theory was that disease was caused by miasma, bad air. So surgeons focused on ventilation, not sterilisation. They'd operate with unwashed hands, wearing blood-crusted aprons, using instruments that hadn't been cleaned since yesterday. Between patients, they'd maybe wiped the knife on their apron. Maybe, if they remembered. The surgeon's hands were coated in blood from previous patients. The surgical table was covered in blood and tissue. The instruments were contaminated. The bandages were often recycled from previous patients. They'd wash them in cold water, which didn't kill bacteria, then reuse them. Every surgery was basically an invitation for bacteria to enter your open wound. The most common infection was gangrene, which came in two forms. Wet gangrene turned your tissue black and soft, producing a horrific smell. Dry gangrene turned your tissue black and hard, like leather. Both were deadly if they spread, and they always spread. The infection timeline was grimly predictable. Day 1, after surgery, you'd feel okay, relatively speaking. The wound hurt, but that was expected. Day 2, fever would start. Low at first, maybe just feeling warm. Day 3, fever would spike. You'd start sweating, shivering, becoming delirious. The wound would smell different, not just like blood anymore, but something fouler. Day 4 or 5, the tissue around your wound would change colour. Red, then darker red, then purple, then black. That's when everyone knew you had gangrene. By day 6 or 7, you were probably dead. Or the surgeons would try to save you by amputating higher up, removing the infected tissue, which just started the infection cycle over again. The bacteria responsible were everywhere. Clostridium perfringens caused gas gangrene, the wet kind. These bacteria thrived in deep wounds with dead tissue and low oxygen. They'd multiply rapidly, producing gas that made the infected tissue crackle when you pressed on it. Literally crackle, like bubble wrap. Patients could hear it happening to their own bodies. The bacteria also produced toxins that destroyed healthy tissue, causing the infection to spread at terrifying speed. An amputation site that looked fine in the morning could be completely necrotic by evening. Streptococcus and staphylococcus bacteria caused other infections. These were less dramatic than gas gangrene, but equally deadly. They'd enter through any break in the skin, and Civil War surgical wounds were nothing but breaks in the skin, large ones sewn up with dirty thread by unwashed hands. The bacteria would multiply in the wound, triggering the body's immune response, fever, inflammation, pus formation. The body was trying to fight the infection, but without antibiotics, it was a losing battle. The infection would enter the bloodstream, sepsis, and spread throughout the body. Organ failure would follow. Death was the inevitable conclusion. Tetanus was another nightmare. Clostridium tetani lived in soil and horse manure, both of which were everywhere on Civil War battlefields. The bacteria would enter through wounds, especially deep puncture wounds, and produce a neurotoxin that caused massive muscle spasms. Lockjaw was the most obvious symptom. The jaw muscles would clench so hard that soldiers couldn't open their mouths. Then the spasms would spread to the whole body. Soldiers would arch backward, every muscle contracted simultaneously, in agony, until finally the respiratory muscles seized and they suffocated. There was no treatment. Once tetanus symptoms appeared, death was certain and horrific. Surgeons noticed patterns without understanding the cause. They saw that certain wounds got infected more than others. Deep wounds with lots of tissue damage were worse than clean cuts. Wounds contaminated with dirt or clothing fragments were worse than those that weren't. Amputations performed in hot weather led to more infections than those in cold weather. They noticed all this and tried to adjust accordingly, but without understanding bacteria, their interventions were mostly ineffective. Some surgeons tried using various antiseptics, though they didn't call them that. They'd pour whiskey or brandy into wounds, which did kill some bacteria through alcohol content, but not enough to matter. They'd use solutions of bromine or iodine, which actually had some antibacterial properties, but they didn't use them consistently or in sufficient concentration. A few surgeons experimented with carbolic acid, the same substance Joseph Lister would later use to pioneer antiseptic surgery in England, but they didn't understand why it sometimes seemed to help. The bandages made everything worse. After surgery, the stump would be wrapped in cotton or linen bandages. These bandages would quickly become soaked with blood and wound drainage. They were supposed to be changed regularly, but regularly might mean once every few days. When they were removed, they'd often stick to the wound, tearing away healing tissue when pulled off. The new bandages applied were often recycled, washed in cold water that didn't kill bacteria, then reused on a different patient. This was direct bacterial transfer from one patient to another. If the previous patient had gangrene, congratulations, now you probably did too. The tragedy is that prevention would have been simple by modern standards. Wash your hands with soap and hot water. Sterilise instruments by boiling them. Use clean bandages for each patient. These basic interventions would have reduced infection rates dramatically, but nobody knew. The surgeons were doing their best with the knowledge they had. They kept their aprons bloody because they thought it looked professional. They used the same instruments on patient after patient because cleaning them seemed unnecessary. They operated with unwashed hands because they didn't know invisible organisms were hitching rides from one patient to the next. The death rate from infection was staggering. Of soldiers who underwent major amputations, about 26% died from infection. For hip or shoulder amputations, the rate was over 75%. You had a better chance of surviving the battlefield than surviving the surgery designed to save you. Soldiers knew this. They'd beg surgeons not to amputate, not because they wanted to keep their limb, but because they knew amputation was often a death sentence, just slower than bleeding out. The surgeons would explain that without amputation, death from gangrene was certain. With amputation, there was a chance. A small chance, but a chance. Many soldiers chose the slow certainty of gangrene over the quick gamble of surgery. The smell of gangrene. Sweet death. We need to talk about the smell because it haunted everyone who experienced it. Gangrene has a distinctive odour described as sweet, rotten, and completely unlike anything else. Imagine meat rotting in summer heat, then add a sickly sweet undertone, then multiply that by 100. That's gangrene. The smell was so powerful that it filled entire hospital buildings. Surgeons could diagnose gangrene from across the room just by smell. Soldiers could identify which tents held dying men without looking inside. The smell soaked into clothing, hair, skin. It was impossible to wash out. Surgeons would go home at night, reeking of it. Their families would smell it on them. Some surgeons became immune to it, their sense of smell deadened by constant exposure. Others never adapted and would retch before every surgery. When gangrene took hold, there was only one treatment: amputate higher up, above the infection, and hope it hadn't already entered the bloodstream. Many soldiers underwent multiple amputations as infection spread. First they'd lose the foot, then the calf, then the entire leg below the knee, then the entire leg above the knee. Some men were amputated down to nothing and died anyway. The sweetness was the worst part according to most descriptions. Your brain expects rotting flesh to smell purely foul, like spoiled meat or sewage. But gangrene added this sweet, almost fruity component that made it even more nauseating because it violated your expectations. That sweetness came from the bacterial breakdown of tissue-releasing various organic compounds. Your nose interpreted these as sweet, and your brain said something is very, very wrong here. The combination of sweet and putrid created an olfactory experience so disturbing that people who smelled it once never forgot it. The smell announced gangrene before any visual signs appeared. A surgeon could walk through a recovery tent and know immediately which patients were developing infections just by following his nose. He'd stop at a particular cot where the soldier looked relatively okay. Maybe had a low fever. Nothing alarming. But the smell was there, faint but distinct. That soldier had maybe 24 hours before the gangrene became visible. The smell was an early warning system. Not that it helped much because the treatment options were limited to amputation or death. Soldiers lying in recovery tents would smell the gangrene in their own wounds and know what was coming. They'd try to hide it, wrapping extra bandages around the wound, hoping the smell would go away. It never did. It only got stronger. Eventually, a surgeon or nurse would notice, and the terrible conversation would happen. We need to take more of the leg. It's the only way. Some soldiers would agree immediately, desperate to survive. Others would refuse, having already lost so much, unwilling to lose more. Both groups usually ended up dead because by the time the smell was that strong, the infection had already spread too far. The clothing problem was real and unsolvable. Surgeons' coats and aprons absorbed the smell. Their uniforms underneath absorbed it. Their undergarments absorbed it. Washing didn't help much because soap and cold water couldn't remove the organic compounds that caused the odour. Hot water helped more, but was rarely available in sufficient quantities. Many surgeons just accepted that they would smell like gangrene for the duration of the war. Their families grew accustomed to it or learned to stay away when father came home from the hospital. Some surgeons tried to mask the smell. They'd smoke cigars constantly, the tobacco smoke providing some olfactory relief. They'd carry handkerchiefs soaked in cologne or camphor and hold them to their noses between patients. Nothing really worked. The gangrene smell was too powerful. It overwhelmed everything else. Soldiers who could walk would sometimes leave the hospital tents just to breathe clean air for a few minutes, even if it meant standing in the rain or cold. Anything was better than that smell. The psychological impact was significant. The smell of gangrene became associated with death in everyone's minds. Have you smelled it? Someone was dying or about to die. This created a constant atmosphere of dread in hospital tents. Even soldiers with minor wounds would become anxious if they caught a whiff of gangrene, worrying their own wound might be developing infection. The smell was a reminder that death was always present, waiting for any opportunity. The multiple amputation cases were particularly tragic. A soldier would come in with a foot wound. The surgeon would amputate below the knee. 3 days later, gangrene appeared in the stump. Another amputation, this time above the knee. A few days later, gangrene again. Another surgery, this time at the hip joint. The most dangerous amputation, with mortality rates over 80%. The soldier would survive the surgery, but die from the infection anyway. His body too traumatised to fight anymore. By the end, he'd lost his entire leg in stages, enduring 4 or 5 separate surgeries, only to die anyway. His family would receive his personal effects and a letter explaining that everything possible had been done. Nurses and hospital stewards who worked in gangrenous wards suffered psychological damage from the constant exposure. They described nightmares where they couldn't escape the smell, even in sleep. Some developed what we'd now recognise as olfactory hallucinations. Smelling gangrene when it wasn't actually present. Their brains had been so traumatised by the constant exposure that the smell had been burned into their memory permanently. Years after the war, veterans would report catching phantom whiffs of gangrene, their minds replaying the trauma through smell memory. The smell also served as a grim bonding experience. Soldiers who'd been in gangrenous wards together would recognise each other years later at veterans' gatherings. They wouldn't need to exchange names. Just, you were there, weren't you, at Gettysburg? In the hospital? The shared memory of that smell created a connection that civilians could never understand. It was proof you'd been through something uniquely horrible, something that marked you forever. The sweetness of death, they called it. Not poetic, just accurate. Gangrene smelled sweet, and it meant death was coming. Simple as that. And every surgeon, every nurse, every hospital steward, and every wounded soldier who survived the Civil War carried that smell in their memory for the rest of their lives. Maggot therapy, the accidental miracle. Here's something bizarre. Maggots saved lives. Surgeons noticed that soldiers whose wounds became infested with maggots actually healed better than those whose wounds stayed clean. Why? Because maggots only eat dead tissue. They'd clean the wound better than any surgeon could, eating away the necrotic flesh while leaving healthy tissue intact. This prevented gangrene from spreading. Some surgeons started deliberately introducing maggots into wounds. They'd let flies land on the patient, then cover the wound with a light bandage. The flies would lay eggs, the eggs would hatch, and the maggots would go to work. It sounds horrifying. And it was. Soldiers could feel the maggots moving inside their wounds. But it worked. Maggot-treated wounds had much lower infection rates. The problem was that nobody understood why it worked. Germ theory wasn't accepted yet, so surgeons just noted the effect without understanding the mechanism. Some surgeons rejected the practice as barbaric. Others embraced it enthusiastically. The discovery wasn't scientific, it was observational. After major battles, wounded men would lie on the battlefield for hours or days before being retrieved. During summer, flies would find them immediately. Flies are attracted to blood and open wounds because that's where they lay their eggs. By the time these soldiers reached field hospitals, their wounds were often crawling with maggots. Surgeons expected these men to die from infection. Instead, many of them healed better than soldiers who'd received immediate treatment in clean conditions. This made no sense according to prevailing medical theory. Bad air caused disease, so surely maggot-infested wounds, clearly the worst possible air quality, should have killed patients faster. But the pattern was undeniable. Surgeons started comparing outcomes. Soldiers with maggots, lower fever, less gangrene, better survival rates. Soldiers without maggots, higher fever, more gangrene, worse survival rates. Some progressive surgeons began asking why. They'd examine maggot-infested wounds closely and noticed the maggots were only eating dead blackened tissue. They weren't touching healthy pink tissue. The wounds were being debrided, cleaned of dead tissue by the maggots themselves. This was doing exactly what surgeons tried to do manually, except the maggots were more thorough and more precise. Confederate surgeon J.F. Zacharias documented cases deliberately using maggot therapy at a hospital in Danville, Virginia. He'd identify wounds with necrotic tissue, introduce fly larvae, then monitor the results. His success rate was significantly better than standard treatment. Other surgeons heard about this, and some tried it themselves. The practice spread through word of mouth, surgeon to surgeon, despite having no official endorsement and making no theoretical sense according to contemporary medicine. The patient experience was psychological torture combined with physical relief. Imagine lying in a hospital bed, looking down at your wound and seeing it moving, squirming. You can feel individual maggots crawling through your tissue. You can see them, white and segmented, dozens or hundreds of them, feeding on parts of your body. Your first instinct is revulsion. Get them off me. Kill them. Clean the wound. But the surgeon says no. Leave them, they're helping. You have to mentally overcome every instinct, screaming that this is wrong and disgusting and harmful. Some soldiers couldn't do it. They'd pick the maggots out, despite orders not to. Others would lie still, tears running down their faces, enduring the sensation of being eaten alive by insects, trusting that the surgeon knew what he was doing. The maggots were usually blowfly larvae, Lucilia sericata, though nobody knew the species name at the time. These flies were everywhere around hospitals and battlefields. They were a nuisance, landing on food, on faces, on everything. On faces, but they were also, accidentally, medical tools. The larvae would hatch within 24 hours of eggs being laid. They'd feed on dead tissue for several days, growing larger. Then they'd drop off or be removed, and the wound would be cleaner than any manual cleaning could achieve. What nobody understood at the time was that maggots also secrete antimicrobial compounds. As they feed, they release substances that kill bacteria. They were providing natural antibiotic treatment a century before antibiotics were discovered. The combination of mechanical debridement, removing dead tissue, plus antimicrobial secretions, made maggot therapy remarkably effective at preventing and treating gangrene. Not all maggots were beneficial. Some fly species laid eggs that hatched into larvae that ate living tissue, not just dead tissue. These were disastrous and would worsen wounds rather than improve them. Surgeons couldn't tell the difference by looking at the flies. They learned through trial and error, noting which types of maggots helped and which ones hurt. The common green blowflies were good. Certain other species were bad. This knowledge was passed along informally. The practice remained controversial throughout the war. Conservative surgeons thought it was disgusting and unprofessional. They'd rather clean wounds manually and apply proper bandages than let insects infest their patients. Progressive surgeons saw results and didn't care about theory. If it worked, use it. This philosophical divide mirrored the broader tension in Civil War medicine between traditional practices and empirical observation. After the war, maggot therapy was mostly abandoned in favour of newer antiseptic techniques. Carbolic acid and proper sterilisation became standard practice. Maggots seemed unnecessary and primitive. The practice was largely forgotten for decades until the 1920s and 1930s, when surgeons rediscovered it and began using it deliberately for diabetic ulcers and other chronic wounds. Modern medicine now uses specially bred, sterile, medical maggots for wound debridement. The Civil War surgeons who accidentally discovered this treatment would be vindicated, though they never knew why it worked. The irony is perfect. In an era where surgeons thought bad air caused disease, the dirtiest, most fly-infested wounds healed best. The discovery that saved lives contradicted everything doctors believed about medicine. But results don't care about theory. Maggots worked, whether anyone understood them or not. The hospital steward, the backbone of medicine. Let's talk about the hospital steward because these men don't get enough credit. The hospital steward was basically a senior medic, not a doctor, but someone with medical training who managed the day-to-day running of the field hospital. He'd dispense medications, prepare instruments, assist in surgery, manage supplies, keep records, and basically do everything the surgeon didn't have time for. During battles, the steward was often the one performing triage when the surgeon was busy operating. He'd walk among the wounded, making quick assessments, directing traffic. You here, you there, you wait. He'd also prepare patients for surgery. This meant cutting away clothing, cleaning the wound as best he could, and positioning the patient on the table. If anesthesia was used, the steward often administered it. After surgery, he'd bandage the wound, move the patient to recovery, and prep the surgical area for the next case. Many stewards were better at practical medicine than the surgeons they assisted. They'd seen more wounds, performed more procedures, and had better instincts. But they weren't doctors, so their opinions were often ignored. Some stewards went on to become doctors after the war. Many others just went home and tried to forget everything they'd seen. The position of hospital steward was an enlisted rank, not an officer rank like surgeon. This meant the steward was technically subordinate to even the youngest, most inexperienced assistant surgeon, fresh out of medical school. But in practice, experienced stewards often ran the show. They knew where supplies were kept. They knew which instruments were needed for which procedures. They knew how to keep the surgical tent organised during chaos. A good steward was worth 3 mediocre surgeons, and everyone knew it, even if the official hierarchy said otherwise. Training for hospital stewards was variable. Some had worked as apothecary assistants or pharmacists in civilian life and already knew about medications and their dosages. Others had been medical students who'd left school to join the army. Some had simply shown aptitude during basic training and been assigned to medical duties. The Army Medical Department ran training programs for stewards, teaching basic anatomy, surgical assisting, and pharmacy. But like everything in Civil War medicine, the real training happened on the job, usually during the first major battle a steward experienced. The medication management role was crucial. The steward maintained the medical supply chest, which contained all the drugs available to the regiment. Morphine, opium, quinine for malaria, calomel for various digestive complaints, whiskey, chloroform if they had it, and various other substances. The steward had to track inventory, requisition new supplies, and prevent theft, because morphine and whiskey had significant black market value. He'd prepare doses according to the surgeon's orders, measuring carefully, because too much morphine killed patients and too little left them in agony. During surgery, the steward was the surgeon's extra pair of hands. He'd hold retracted tissue. He'd hand over instruments before being asked, anticipating what the surgeon needed next based on the stage of the operation. He'd manage the sponging, keeping the surgical field clear of blood so the surgeon could see. He'd watch the patient's condition, alerting the surgeon if breathing became irregular or pulse weakened. And he'd do all this while also managing whatever crisis was happening outside the surgical tent. New one, wounded arriving, supplies running low, a patient dying in recovery who needed last rites. The administrative burden was significant. The steward kept records of every patient. Name, regiment, type of wound, treatment provided, outcome. This paperwork was theoretically important for army bureaucracy, but practically it was often neglected during heavy casualties. You don't have time to fill out forms when men are bleeding out. But after the battle, the steward would spend days reconstructing records from memory, trying to document who'd been treated, who'd survived, who'd died, and where bodies had been buried. These records were often the only official acknowledgements that a soldier had existed and died. The relationship between surgeon and steward varied. Some surgeons treated their stewards as valued assistants, consulting them on difficult cases, trusting their judgment. Others treated them as servants, ignoring their input, demanding they follow orders without question. The best surgical teams had mutual respect. The surgeon handled the cutting and major decisions. The steward handled everything else, and occasionally saved the surgeon from mistakes. Sir, we already tried quinine on this patient, it didn't help. Or, sir, that instrument isn't sterile. Though sterile wasn't really a concept yet. Some stewards were cleaner than others through intuition. The stress on hospital stewards was immense. They worked the same impossible hours as surgeons, but without the authority or recognition. They made life or death decisions during triage, but couldn't officially be blamed if they chose wrong, because officially the surgeon was responsible. They watched men die from infections that might have been prevented with better sanitation, but they had no power to change procedures. They knew more about practical medicine than most surgeons, but couldn't become surgeons themselves without medical school, which required money and time most enlisted men didn't have. After battles, while surgeons could rest briefly, stewards had to organise the aftermath, inventory remaining supplies, arrange transport for wounded who were stable enough to move, supervise burial details, comfort dying men, write letters to families, clean instruments or at least rinse them, reorganise the hospital tent for the next crisis. The work never ended. Many stewards suffered psychological breakdowns. The combination of horrific sights, impossible workload, lack of sleep, and no authority to change anything created unbearable stress. Some requested transfer to combat units, preferring to face bullets than spend another day in the surgical tent. Others became alcoholics, self-medicating with the whiskey they were supposed to dispense to patients. A few became excellent at their work through sheer compartmentalisation, treating it like any other job, somehow maintaining sanity by refusing to think too deeply about what they were doing. The best hospital stewards were the invisible backbone of Civil War medicine. Surgeons got the credit and the officer commissions. Stewards got exhaustion, trauma, and occasionally a promotion to sergeant if they were lucky. After the war, some leveraged their experience into medical careers. Others tried to forget and mostly succeeded. Their names don't appear in medical history books, but without them, the death toll would have been even higher. Surgical mistakes. When things go horribly wrong, surgical mistakes were common for the obvious reason that you're performing complex procedures in terrible conditions with limited training. Surgeons would sometimes amputate the wrong limb, operating on the right leg when the left was injured. This happened more often than you'd think, especially when the surgeon was exhausted and the patient was unconscious. Sometimes surgeons cut too high or too low, cut too low, and you left infected tissue behind, cut too high, and you removed more limb than necessary, making recovery harder and future prosthetics less effective. Sometimes surgeons severed blood vessels they didn't mean to sever, causing hemorrhages that killed the patient hours later. Sometimes they left bone fragments in the wound, which would work their way to the surface months later, requiring another surgery. Sometimes the anesthesia killed the patient. An overdose could stop breathing. An underdose meant the patient woke mid-surgery and began thrashing. And sometimes surgeons just made decisions that seem insane in retrospect. Like the surgeon who decided to amputate at the hip joint, an incredibly dangerous procedure with a 90% mortality rate, when amputation below the knee might have worked fine. The wrong limb amputations were particularly tragic because they were completely preventable. The protocol, such as it existed, was simple. Look at the patient. Identify the injured limb. Operate on that limb. But after operating for 18 hours straight on your 40th patient of the day, exhausted and operating by candlelight, mistakes happened. The surgeon would position himself on the wrong side of the table. The assistant would hand him instruments without questioning. The cut would be made. The limb would come off. And only afterward, when moving the patient to recovery, Would someone notice that the injured limb was still attached and the healthy limb was gone? What happened next varied. Some surgeons immediately amputated the actually injured limb, leaving the patient with 2 stumps instead of 1. The logic was that the injured limb would kill the patient through gangrene anyway, so you might as well remove it. Other surgeons refused to compound the error and tried to save the remaining injured limb through other means. Most of these patients died anyway, either from infection in the injured limb or from shock and blood loss from losing 2 limbs. The few who survived face life with 2 amputations when they should have had only 1. These mistakes weren't officially recorded because no surgeon wanted to document his own catastrophic error, but word spread through soldiers' letters and diaries. The doc took off Johnny's good leg by mistake, then had to take the bad one too. He died 3 days later. These stories terrified wounded soldiers. The fear wasn't just losing a limb, it was losing the wrong limb through someone else's incompetence while he lay unconscious and helpless. Cutting at the wrong level was more common and harder to classify as pure mistake versus judgment error. Every amputation required a decision: where to cut. Too close to the injury, and you risked leaving infected tissue that would require reamputation. Too far from the injury, and you removed more limb than necessary, making the patient more disabled than they needed to be. Surgeons were supposed to cut about 2 inches above visible injury to ensure all damaged tissue was removed. But judging 2 inches above visible injury in a mangled limb covered in blood was difficult. Some surgeons erred on the side of cutting higher. Better to remove extra healthy tissue than leave any infection risk. Others tried to preserve as much limb as possible. Both approaches had their advocates and their casualties. Severed blood vessels were usually mistakes of anatomy ignorance or surgical carelessness. The major vessels, femoral artery, brachial artery, were supposed to be identified, isolated, and ligated carefully. But in the chaos of rapid surgery, sometimes a surgeon would cut through a vessel without seeing it, or would tie it off inadequately, or would accidentally cut the knot while trimming the excess thread. The patient would seem fine immediately after surgery. Then hours later, they'd start bleeding internally. By the time anyone realised what was happening, they'd lost too much blood to save. They'd die quietly, confused about what was happening, while the surgeon was busy operating on other patients and never knew his earlier patient had died from his mistake. Bone fragments were an insidious problem. When sawing through bone, small splinters and fragments would break off. These were supposed to be removed from the wound before closing. But in dim lighting, with blood obscuring everything, it was easy to miss them. The wound would be sewn up with bone fragments still inside. The patient would seem to recover. Then weeks or months later, the body would start pushing these fragments out through the skin. A hard lump would appear. It would grow painful. Eventually, it would break through the skin, and a piece of bone would emerge, weeks after the original surgery. This required opening the wound again, searching for more fragments, then closing it again, and hoping no infection developed. Anesthesia deaths were particularly frustrating because the patient had survived the injury, survived battlefield evacuation, survived triage, survived being placed on the surgical table, and then died from the treatment meant to spare them pain. Chloroform overdose stopped the heart or respiratory system. There was no way to reverse it once it happened. The patient would simply stop breathing. The surgeon would notice, try to stimulate breathing manually, pressing on the chest, slapping the face, but usually it was too late. The irony was unbearable. You were trying to help them. You gave them anesthesia to be merciful, and it killed them. The decision-making errors were harder to judge. Surgeons made choices based on limited information under extreme pressure. A shattered knee joint might be treated by amputation below the knee, above the knee, or at the hip, depending on how bad the damage looked and how conservative or aggressive the surgeon was. Years later, reviewing these cases, it's easy to say, obviously he should have tried to save more of the leg. But in the moment, covered in blood, exhausted, with 30 more patients waiting, making the perfect decision every time was impossible. Some surgeons were too aggressive, amputating when they might have tried to save the limb. Others were too conservative, trying to save limbs that were clearly unsalvageable, wasting time on hopeless cases, while salvageable patients died waiting. Mistakes haunted the surgeons who made them. Many carried guilt for decades. In letters and memoirs written after the war, surgeons would confess errors they'd made. I took too much of his arm. He could have had more function if I'd cut lower. I missed a vessel. He bled to death in recovery. These confessions suggest a level of self-awareness and moral responsibility that's almost heartbreaking. They knew they'd made mistakes. They knew men had died because of those mistakes, and they had to live with that knowledge forever. The recovery tent, surviving the surgery. If you survive surgery, you'd be moved to a recovery tent. This was often worse than the surgical tent, because it's where men went to either heal or die, and the dying process could take days. The recovery tent was filled with rows of wounded men, lying on the ground or on rough cots if they were lucky. There was no nursing staff, as we'd understand it today. Male nurses, usually soldiers, who were recovering from their own injuries, would move between patients offering water, changing bandages, and recording who had died since the last check. The heat in summer recovery tents was unbearable. The smell was worse than the surgical tent, because wounds were festering, men were dying, and bodies couldn't always be removed immediately. In winter, the tents were freezing. Men would develop pneumonia on top of their surgical wounds. The mortality rate in recovery tents was staggering. Of men who underwent major amputations, about 25 to 30% died from post-surgical complications. For hip or shoulder amputations, the rate was over 80%. You'd lie in that tent for days or weeks, hoping the fever didn't come, hoping the wound didn't turn black, hoping you were one of the lucky ones. The layout was brutally efficient. Rows of men, maybe 2 feet apart, stretching the length of the tent. Sometimes 100 men in a single tent. Sometimes more. You could reach out and touch the men on either side of you. You'd hear everything they said, every moan, every prayer, every cry for water or mother or God. And they'd hear yours. There was no privacy, no dignity, no escape from the suffering around you. This was your world until you healed or died. The cots were just canvas, stretched across wooden frames. If you got one, you were fortunate. Many men lay directly on the ground, with maybe a blanket underneath if supplies permitted. The ground was dirt, sometimes covered with straw that quickly became soiled with blood and bodily fluids. In rainy weather, the ground turned to mud. Men would lie in it, unable to move, their wounds getting contaminated with dirt, their chances of survival dropping with every hour. Water was provided, but not constantly. Nurses would make rounds with buckets and ladles, offering drinks to conscious patients. But after major battles with hundreds of wounded, these rounds might happen only once every few hours. Men would spend hours desperately thirsty, their mouths dry from fever and blood loss, unable to get anyone's attention, because everyone was busy with dying patients who needed attention more urgently than someone who just wanted water. Bandage changes were supposed to happen daily, but often didn't. The ideal was to check each wound daily, remove the old bandage, clean the wound, apply fresh dressing. Reality was that with limited staff and limited supplies, bandages stayed on for days. They'd become soaked with drainage, blood, and pus. They'd stick to the wound, and removing them would tear away healing tissue and cause fresh bleeding. The new bandages weren't much better, because they'd often been cleaned by rinsing in cold water and were being reused from previous patients. The fever watch was constant and terrible. Every amputee knew the timeline. Day 1, relatively okay. Day 2 or 3, fever starts. This was the critical period. A low fever might be normal inflammatory response to surgery. A high fever meant infection. But there was no way to know which was which until the wound declared itself. Men would lie there, monitoring their own temperature through sensation. Am I too hot? Is this normal post-surgical warmth or infection starting? They'd call for nurses to check, and the nurse would place a hand on their forehead. That was the diagnostic test. How hot does his head feel? No thermometers, no objective measurements, just an experienced hand saying, he's burning up, or he's warm but okay. When infection was confirmed and gangrene set in, the patient faced a choice that wasn't really a choice. Reamputation, higher up, or death. Most chose reamputation because humans have a powerful instinct to survive, even when survival meant more suffering. So back to the surgical tents, back under the saw, losing more of the limb. Some men went through this 3 or 4 times, each surgery removing more, each recovery period worse than the last, until finally there was nothing left to remove and they died anyway. The sound in recovery tents was haunting. Constant moaning at a low level, like background noise. Occasional screaming when someone's pain spiked beyond tolerance. Crying, sometimes open sobbing from grown men who'd reached their breaking point. Prayers whispered or shouted, depending on the person's state. Some men recited the same prayer over and over, a verbal loop providing psychological comfort. Others had conversations with people who weren't there, mothers, wives, God, sometimes dead comrades. The night was worse than the day. At night you couldn't see what was happening around you. You'd hear a man die, the distinctive rattle in the throat, the final exhale, but you wouldn't know who it was until morning. You'd hear nurses walking between cots, their footsteps stopping periodically. Were they checking on someone? Had someone died? You couldn't see, only hear, and your imagination filled in the terrible details. Disease spread easily in these conditions. Typhoid, dysentery, pneumonia, erysipelas, all thrived in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Men who survived their surgical wounds would die from diseases they caught in the recovery tent. The sick and the surgical wounded were often housed together because there weren't enough tents to separate them. So the soldier, recovering from amputation, would be lying next to a soldier with typhoid, and 3 days later, the amputation patient would develop typhoid. And that would be the end. The psychological toll was immense. You're lying there, unable to move, watching men around you die one by one, knowing you might be next. Some men handled this through faith, God's will, whatever happens. Others handled it through denial. I'll be fine, I'm getting better, the fever is going down. Others broke mentally, becoming catatonic or hysterical, unable to process the trauma. There was no psychiatric care, no counselling, no treatment for what we'd now recognise as acute stress disorder. You either held yourself together or you didn't. The lucky ones recovered enough to be transported to general hospitals farther from the front. Real buildings with beds and better care. The unlucky ones died in the recovery tent and were buried nearby, their possessions sent home with a letter, and some, neither lucky nor unlucky, just stayed there week after week, their wounds not healing, but not killing them either, stuck in limbo. Letters home. Telling families. One of the surgeon's duties was writing letters to families. After a soldier died, someone had to inform his parents, wife, or children. Usually this fell to the company commander, but surgeons often wrote medical details, explaining what happened. These letters were brutal in their honesty. Your son received a gunshot wound to the abdomen. Despite our best efforts, peritonitis developed, and he expired on the 3rd day. Your husband's leg was amputated following a shell fragment injury. He survived the surgery, but succumbed to infection 5 days later. Surgeons would write dozens of these letters after major battles. They'd sit in their tents late at night, exhausted, trying to find words that would make sense of the senseless. Some surgeons were kind, adding personal details. He spoke of you often. He felt no pain at the end. Some were clinical, just stating facts. Most were somewhere in between, trying to balance honesty with compassion. The families who received these letters would keep them forever. They were the only official record of how their loved one died. Many of these letters still exist in archives, fading ink on yellowed paper, documenting the precise moment a family's world ended. The surgeon would sit at a makeshift desk, usually just a board across 2 barrels, with a stack of personal effects beside him. A soldier's belongings, after death, amounted to very little. Maybe a watch, a few coins, a Bible, letters from home, a tin-type photograph. The surgeon would go through these items, looking for addresses, trying to figure out who to write to. Sometimes there was a clear, in case of emergency, notify, written inside a Bible cover. Sometimes there was nothing, and the surgeon had to write to the company commander asking for family information. The actual writing was emotionally exhausting. How do you tell a mother her son is dead? How do you explain to a wife that her husband died, screaming in agony, over 3 days from an infected or amputation? The truth was too horrible. But lies felt wrong too. Most surgeons developed standard phrases that conveyed the essential information while softening the worst details. He did not suffer was a common one, even when it was completely untrue. He spoke of you At the end was another, whether the patient had been conscious or not. These small mercies cost nothing and gave families some comfort. Some surgeons struggled with the medical explanations. How technical should you be telling a farmer's wife that her husband died from septicemia secondary to traumatic amputation meant nothing to her, but saying his leg wound got infected and poisoned his blood was clearer, if no less painful. The best surgeons learned to write in plain language that families could understand without being condescending. The volume after major battles was overwhelming. After Gettysburg, surgeons were writing 50, 100, sometimes more letters. Each one required thought and care because each one was delivering the worst news a family could receive. But there wasn't time for thought and care. You had to write quickly, efficiently, moving through the stack of names. This created a tension between honouring the dead individual and simply processing the paperwork so you could move on to the next crisis. Some surgeons kept copies of the letters they wrote. We don't know if this was official policy or personal choice, but it meant that years later, historians could read these documents and understand what happened. The copies reveal patterns. Early in the war, letters were longer and more personal. As the war dragged on and casualties mounted, letters became shorter and more formulaic. The emotional exhaustion shows in the handwriting itself, shaky, rushed, words occasionally crossed out. The personal details, when included, were often invented. He was brave until the end was standard, even when the soldier had begged for death. He thought of you constantly was written even when the surgeon had never spoken to the patient before surgery. These weren't malicious lies. They were kindnesses. What purpose did it serve to tell a mother that her son had died, terrified, and calling for her? Better to give her the comfort of believing he'd been brave and thinking of her. Occasionally, surgeons would include specific final words if the soldier had been conscious before death. Tell Mary I love her, or take care of the children, or I did my duty. These genuine last statements were precious to families. They proved their loved one had existed as an individual, had thoughts and feelings, hadn't just been a statistic in a casualty report. The letters about amputations were particularly difficult. How do you tell parents their son lost both legs and then died anyway? The amputation seemed like failure compounded. You'd mutilated their son and then failed to save him. Surgeons tried to frame amputations as necessary medical interventions. Without the surgery, he would have died immediately. The operation gave him a chance. This was true, but probably didn't comfort families much. Confederate surgeons faced additional challenges as the war progressed, and the postal system became unreliable in the South. Letters might take months to arrive, or never arrive at all. Surgeons would write letters knowing they might never be delivered, but they wrote them anyway, because it was their duty. Some of these letters were found years later in abandoned Confederate offices, never mailed. The families never officially informed of deaths. Chaplains sometimes helped with letter writing, especially for illiterate families. Right? The surgeon would provide medical facts, and the chaplain would add spiritual comfort. Your son is with God now, and similar phrases that the surgeon focused on physical medicine might not think to include. This collaboration resulted in letters that addressed both the physical reality and spiritual meaning of death. Families treasured these letters. They'd be read at funerals, passed around to relatives, kept in Bibles, and preserved as sacred objects. Many families had no body to bury. Their son or husband had been interred in a mass grave near the battlefield. The letter was their only tangible connection to his death. It proved he'd died, explained how, and sometimes provided comfort that he hadn't suffered too much. Years after the war, veterans' organisations would sometimes help families track down the surgeons who'd written these letters. Parents would write, asking for more details. Did he really not suffer? Was he conscious? Did he say anything else? Most surgeons tried to respond honestly but kindly, adding details they'd left out of the original letter when they thought the family was ready to hear them. Some surgeons refused to elaborate, believing the original letter had said enough, and reopening the wound served no purpose. The letters remain in archives today, thousands of them, each one a small tragedy, each one documenting a moment when a surgeon sat down, exhausted, and tried to explain death to people who'd never understand why their loved one had to die, in a tent far from home, in a war that probably shouldn't have happened. The ambulance corps getting you there alive. The journey from battlefield to field hospital was often more dangerous than the surgery itself. The ambulance corps was created in 1862, after the disaster at the Battle of Bull Run, where wounded men lay on the battlefield for days because there was no organised system to retrieve them. The ambulance was a two-wheeled or four-wheeled cart pulled by horses or mules. It had no suspension. The roads were rough. Every bump sent waves of agony through your shattered body. The ambulance drivers were usually soldiers assigned to the duty, not medical personnel. They'd load as many wounded as possible, 4 to 6 men, in a small ambulance, a dozen in a larger one, and drive as fast as they could to the field hospital. Many men died during transport. The combination of blood loss, shock, and the brutal ride was too much. Some fell out of the ambulances when drivers hit deep ruts. Some died and weren't discovered until arrival, their bodies stiff and cold among the living. The drivers were supposed to prioritise the worst wounded, but in practice, they often grabbed whoever was closest to the road. Men who crawled toward the sound of the ambulances had better chances than those who couldn't move. Before the ambulance corps was established, battlefield evacuation was complete chaos. Regimental bandsmen, musicians who didn't fight, were supposed to retrieve wounded, but they had no training and often panicked under fire. Sometimes they'd abandon the wounded and run. Sometimes they'd grab the first officer they found, leaving enlisted men to die because officers were considered more valuable. At Bull Run in 1861, wounded Union soldiers lay on the field for 3 days in July heat because nobody came for them. Those who survived did so by crawling miles to find help or by being captured by Confederates who at least moved them under shelter. The reformed ambulance corps, established in 1862 for the Union Army, created a dedicated evacuation system. Each regiment was assigned ambulances and trained stretcher bearers. The drivers were supposed to be reliable soldiers who wouldn't panic under fire. In practice, ambulance duty was often assigned to soldiers who were considered unfit for combat, the sick, the cowardly, the incompetent. So your life depended on someone who'd already proven they couldn't handle pressure. The two-wheeled ambulances were cheaper and could navigate rough terrain better, but they were absolutely brutal for wounded passengers. Every bump translated directly to the patient with no suspension to absorb the impact. If you had a shattered leg, every jolt sent bone fragments grinding together. If you had an abdominal wound, the constant jarring could cause internal bleeding. The two-wheeled design also meant the ambulance tilted dramatically on uneven ground, sometimes dumping patients out the back. The four-wheeled ambulances were better, but still primitive. They had a canvas cover to protect from sun and rain, which was helpful. They could carry more patients, which was efficient. But they were heavier, slower, and got stuck in mud more easily than the two-wheeled versions. In wet weather, which was common, four-wheeled ambulances would sink to their axles in mud, and wounded men would have to be unloaded, carried around the stuck ambulance, and loaded into another one. Meanwhile, they're bleeding and dying. The stretcher bearers who retrieved wounded from the battlefield were supposed to work in pairs, carrying men on canvas stretchers. This required walking through areas still under fire, finding wounded among the dead, determining who was salvageable, and carrying them back. The bearers were unarmed, because Geneva Convention rules said medical personnel shouldn't be targeted. In practice, not everyone respected this rule. Stretcher bearers were shot regularly. Some wore red bands on their arms to identify themselves as medical personnel. This made them targets for snipers who knew that killing stretcher bearers meant wounded enemies would die untreated. The loading process was rushed and rough. The bearers would arrive with a wounded man, slide him into the ambulance, and immediately return for the next one. No time to position him carefully or secure him. You'd just be tossed in, maybe landing on top of another wounded man, maybe having someone land on top of you. If you screamed from pain, nobody cared. Everyone was screaming. The ride itself was nightmarish. The ambulance would start moving immediately, often before the doors were even closed. The driver's priority was speed, get to the hospital fast, get these men off, return for more. The roads were dirt tracks torn up by artillery and thousands of marching feet, ruts a foot deep, rocks and debris. The ambulance would slam through all of it at maximum speed. Inside, wounded men would be thrown against each other and against the wooden walls. There was nothing to hold on to. If you tried to brace yourself against the jolting, you'd use muscles connected to your wound and cause yourself more pain. The noise was constant, the wheels creaking and banging, the horses straining, the wounded men moaning or screaming. And sometimes, during the ride, you'd realise the man next to you had stopped making noise and wasn't breathing. You'd spend the rest of the ride pressed against a corpse, unable to move away, knowing you might be next. Some wounded men begged to be left on the battlefield, rather than endure the ambulance ride. They'd tell stretcher bearers, "Just leave me, I can't survive the trip." Sometimes they were right. The combination of blood loss, shock, and the brutal transport was too much. Their bodies just gave up. They'd die en route, and the ambulance would arrive at the field hospital with one fewer patient than it left with. The drivers developed a grim efficiency. They learned which roads had the fewest ruts. They learned how to navigate around obstacles. They learned to identify which wounded men were likely to survive the trip and which weren't. This last skill was unofficial and morally questionable, but practical. Why waste space on someone who'll be dead in 10 minutes when you could use that space for someone who might survive? Confederate ambulances were even worse. The South had fewer resources, fewer trained drivers, and worse roads. Many Confederate wounded were transported in commandeered farm wagons with no medical equipment whatsoever. Just a wooden wagon, pulled by whatever animal was available. The mortality rate during Confederate ambulance transport was significantly higher than Union rates. Not because of medical differences, but purely because of transportation quality. The ambulance corps saved thousands of lives by getting wounded men to surgeons quickly, but it also killed hundreds through the brutal conditions of transport. For every soldier who survived the ride and survived surgery, there was another who died en route, his last moments spent being bounced around in a wooden box that smelled like blood and death, wondering if the hospital was close or if he'd die before arrival. The surgeon's mental state, breaking point. Let's talk about what this did to the surgeons psychologically. These men were in their 20s and 30s, most of them. They'd studied medicine in peaceful times, expecting to deliver babies and set broken bones in small town practices. Now they were performing 40 amputations a day while wounded men screamed and died around them. Many surgeons developed what we'd now recognise as PTSD. They'd have nightmares about piles of limbs. They'd wake up thinking they heard screaming. Some became alcoholics, drinking to numb themselves. Some became completely numb, emotionally dead, just going through the motions. Others had breakdowns. They'd be operating, everything normal, and suddenly they'd just stop, put down the saw, walk out of the tent, sit on the ground and stare at nothing. Some never came back. Some surgeons found meaning in the work. They'd convinced themselves that every life saved justified the horror. They'd focus on success stories, the men who walked away, the ones who recovered, against odds. But the success stories were outnumbered by the failures, and keeping yourself mentally intact required either deep faith, deep denial, or some combination of both. The transformation happened gradually. The first amputation was traumatic, cutting into living flesh, sawing through bone, a human being screaming underneath you. Most young surgeons vomited afterward, or at least felt sick. They'd question whether they could do this job, but there was no time for questioning, because the next patient was already waiting. So you did the second amputation, then the third. By the 10th, you developed a protective emotional numbness. You stopped seeing patients as individuals and started seeing them as medical problems to solve. Shattered femur equals above knee amputation. Mangled hand equals amputation at the wrist. This dehumanization was psychologically necessary, because if you maintained empathy for every patient, you'd collapse under the emotional weight. But dehumanization came with costs. Surgeons who successfully numbed themselves to survive the work found they couldn't turn the numbness off afterward. They'd returned to civilian practice after the war, and discover they felt nothing for their patients. The farmer with a broken arm, the child with fever. They couldn't summon the compassion these cases deserved. They'd become efficient but emotionally dead physicians, technically competent but unable to connect with patients as humans. Their families noticed too. Wives reported that their husbands came home from the war changed, distant, unable to express emotion. The nightmares were universal among Civil War surgeons. They'd dream of operating endlessly, the pile of limbs growing, new wounded, arriving faster than they could operate. They'd dream of patients dying on the table, blood everywhere, unable to stop the bleeding. They'd dream of making mistakes, amputating the wrong limb, killing patients through incompetence. Some nightmares were memories of real events, replayed with perfect accuracy. Others were distorted horror shows, where reality mixed with fear. Either way, sleep became unreliable. Surgeons would wake multiple times per night, sweating, heart racing, sometimes unclear whether they were in their bedroom or back in the surgical tent. The alcoholism was predictable and widespread. Whiskey was readily available. It numbed emotional pain efficiently. After a day of amputations, a surgeon could drink until the images faded, until the screaming in his memory quieted, until he could sleep without dreams. This worked short-term. Long-term, it created addictions that ruined careers and families. Some surgeons maintained functional alcoholism for years, showing up to work sober enough, drinking alone at night. Others descended into obvious addiction, showing up drunk to surgeries, making mistakes, eventually being removed from duty. The complete breakdowns were less common but more dramatic. A surgeon would be mid-operation, saw in hand, cutting through bone, and something would snap. Maybe it was the patient's scream, maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the cumulative weight of every previous amputation, suddenly crashing down. The surgeon would freeze, then drop the saw, then walk away. Sometimes he'd explain himself. I can't do this anymore. Sometimes he'd say nothing, just leave. These surgeons were usually granted medical leave for nervous exhaustion, which was the 1860s term for psychological breakdown. Some recovered after rest, others never returned to medicine. The letters and diaries from Civil War surgeons reveal the internal struggle. They'd write about feeling like butchers rather than healers. They'd write about hating themselves for becoming numb to suffering. They'd write about the specific patients who haunted them. The boy who looked like their son. The man who begged them not to amputate. The soldier who died because the surgeon made a mistake. These writings show self-awareness and moral sensitivity, which makes their suffering more poignant. They weren't psychopaths who enjoyed the carnage. They were normal people forced into abnormal circumstances, doing their best to maintain humanity while performing inhumane tasks. Some surgeons found solace in religion. They'd pray before surgery, asking God for guidance and steady hands. They'd frame their work as divine service, God's instrument, saving lives. When patients died, they'd convince themselves it was God's will, it's not their failure. This religious framework provided psychological protection. If God was in control, then the surgeon wasn't personally responsible for every death. This belief allowed some surgeons to continue working without breaking down. Others used dark humour as a coping mechanism, Surgeons would joke about the pile of limbs, make puns about being disarmed or defeated, laugh at the absurdity of their situation. This humour horrified outsiders, but made sense within the surgical tent. When you're surrounded by death and suffering, sometimes laughing is the only alternative to crying. The humour wasn't meant to disrespect patients. It was meant to create psychological distance from horror. The most successful surgeons psychologically were those who could compartmentalise effectively. They'd shut down emotionally during work, operating with mechanical efficiency. Then afterward, they'd allow themselves to feel grief, horror, guilt in controlled doses. They'd write in journals, talk to chaplains, maintain rituals that helped process the trauma. This required sophisticated emotional regulation that not everyone possessed, but those who did manage to survive the war psychologically intact. The failure rate was high. Estimates suggest that 20 to 30% of Civil War surgeons developed some serious mental health problems during or after the war. Some committed suicide, others drank themselves to death. Many simply left medicine, unable to continue in a profession that reminded them of trauma. The ones who continued practicing often became advocates for better medical training, better surgical conditions, anything to ensure future doctors wouldn't have to experience what they'd experienced. The tragedy is that there was no treatment available. Modern therapy, PTSD treatment, trauma counselling, none of this existed. Surgeons just had to survive their psychological wounds, the same way their patients survived physical wounds, through luck, constitution, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. Women nurses, Clara Barton and the Angels. Women weren't supposed to be near battlefields. It wasn't proper. But women showed up anyway, and they revolutionised field medicine. Clara Barton is the most famous, but there were thousands of others. They worked as nurses, cooks, laundresses and organisers. They brought supplies, managed logistics, and provided care that the army medical system couldn't or wouldn't provide. Male surgeons initially resisted female nurses. They thought women were too delicate, too emotional. They were wrong. Women proved to be better at patient care than the male nurses. They were more organised, more compassionate, and less likely to steal the patient's morphine. Clara Barton arrived at battlefield hospitals with wagons full of supplies, bandages, food, medicines, often getting there before the official army supply chain. She'd work alongside surgeons, assisting in operations, comforting dying men, writing letters home for those who couldn't write. She once had a bullet pass through her sleeve and kill the man she was caring for. She kept working. Other women worked in general hospitals farther from the front. They'd receive patients after they'd been stabilised at field hospitals, then nurse them through recovery or death. These women saw the long-term consequences of battlefield medicine, the infections, the amputations that didn't heal, the mental breakdowns. The resistance to female nurses was institutional and cultural. The US Army Medical Department didn't officially authorise female nurses until 1861, and even then, with severe restrictions. Dorothea Dix was appointed Superintendent of Army Nurses and given the task of recruiting suitable women. Her requirements were absurdly specific. Women had to be over 30 years old, plain in appearance, and dressed in brown or black with no jewellery or adornments. The goal was to make them as unattractive and non-distracting as possible, so male soldiers and surgeons wouldn't be tempted by their presence. This tells you everything about how the army viewed women, not as medical professionals, but as potential moral threats. Despite these restrictions, over 3,000 women served as official Union nurses during the war. Thousands more served unofficially, showing up at hospitals and working without formal authorization, because the need was so desperate that nobody turned away competent help. The Confederacy also employed female nurses, though in smaller numbers and with even more restrictive policies. Southern cultural norms about women's proper roles were stricter, making it harder for women to enter medical work, even when the need was obvious. Clara Barton embodied the independent, unofficial approach. She never officially joined Dorothea Dix's nursing course. Instead, she operated independently, using her own money and donated supplies to provide care where it was needed most. She'd read newspaper reports about battles, immediately head toward the fighting, and arrive at field hospitals before official supply wagons. Surgeons learned to love her because she brought desperately needed supplies and asked for nothing except the opportunity to help. She'd work 24-hour shifts during major battles, assisting in surgeries, distributing supplies, and providing comfort to dying men. The bullet through her sleeve at Antietam became legendary. It killed the soldier she was giving water to, missing her by inches. She didn't leave the field. She moved to the next patient. The practical nursing skills women brought were desperately needed. Male nurses, often soldiers recovering from their own wounds, lacked training and motivation. They'd do the minimum required: distribute water, change bandages occasionally, record deaths. Female nurses approached the work differently. They'd anticipate patient needs, maintain cleanliness as much as possible, provide emotional support, and actually care about outcomes. Soldiers noticed the difference immediately. Letters home would mention the lady nurses with gratitude and affection. The presence of women made the hospital environment slightly more civilized, slightly less like a butcher shop. The emotional labour women provided was perhaps more valuable than their practical nursing. Wounded soldiers, many of them teenage boys, desperately wanted maternal comfort. They'd cry for their mothers. Female nurses provided surrogate maternal care, holding hands, wiping faces, speaking gently, staying with dying men so they wouldn't die alone. Male nurses and surgeons, overwhelmed and emotionally numb, couldn't provide this. Women could and did, often at great psychological cost to themselves. The work destroyed the myth of female delicacy. Women proved they could handle blood, gore, amputation, death, all of it without fainting or becoming hysterical. They worked in the same horrific conditions as male medical staff, saw the same terrible sights, smelled the same awful smells, and continued functioning. Surgeons who'd initially resisted female nurses became their strongest advocates. A good female nurse was worth her weight in gold, more valuable than most male medical assistants. Some women became legendary. Mary Ann Bickerdike, called Mother Bickerdike, worked in Western Theatre hospitals and became famous for her no-nonsense approach. She'd override surgeons if she thought they were wrong. She'd steal supplies from other units if her patients needed them. and she'd physically fight anyone who threatened her patients. Generals respected her. Soldiers loved her. She terrified incompetent medical staff. When someone complained to General Sherman about her unauthorized actions, he reportedly said, "She ranks me." Louisa May Alcott, who'd later write Little Women, served as a nurse at Union Hotel Hospital in Georgetown. Her letters describing the experience are harrowing. The smells, the suffering, the inadequate care. She contracted typhoid from patients and nearly died, ending her nursing service after just 6 weeks. But those 6 weeks gave her material for stories and a lifelong respect for what soldiers endured. Southern women faced additional challenges. Many plantations and large homes were converted into hospitals, putting women in close proximity to wounded soldiers. Cultural norms said this was inappropriate. Unmarried women shouldn't be around men in various states of undress, even wounded men. But practicality won. When hundreds of wounded were dying for lack of care, propriety took a back seat. Southern women became nurses, often without leaving their own homes, which became battlefield hospitals by necessity. The psychological toll on female nurses was severe. They witnessed the same horrors as male medical staff, but had fewer outlets for processing trauma. They were expected to maintain feminine composure, even while covered in blood. Many developed what we'd now recognise as PTSD. Some never recovered, spending their post-war lives as invalids, their health broken by wartime service. After the war, female nurses were largely written out of medical history. Their contributions were minimised or ignored. Clara Barton spent decades fighting for recognition of female nurses' service. The official records focused on surgeons and officers, not nurses. It took generations for historians to acknowledge that women had been absolutely essential to Civil War medical care, that thousands of soldiers owed their lives to female nurses who worked without official recognition, adequate pay, or post-war benefits. They showed up anyway because men were dying and someone had to help. That choice changed medicine forever. Pioneering techniques, learning through horror. Despite the primitive conditions, Civil War surgeons developed and refined techniques that advanced medicine. They pioneered mass triage systems still used today. They perfected rapid amputation techniques. The 3-minute amputation became a benchmark for surgical skill. They learned which wounds were survivable and which weren't, creating the first real battlefield medicine protocols. They experimented with new approaches. Some surgeons tried leaving bullets in place rather than digging them out, finding that this sometimes led to better outcomes. Others experimented with different amputation heights, learning optimal places to cut for different injuries. They documented everything. Medical records from the Civil War are remarkably detailed. Thousands of case studies describing wounds, treatments, and outcomes. This data would be analysed for decades afterward, forming the foundation for modern trauma surgery. The Civil War was essentially a massive, horrible medical experiment. The knowledge gained came at tremendous cost, but it saved countless lives in future conflicts. The bullet extraction debate represented a major philosophical shift. Traditional surgical wisdom said foreign objects must be removed from wounds immediately. Bullets, shell fragments, bits of clothing, everything had to come out. or the wound would fester. Civil War surgeons followed this protocol initially, spending precious time probing wounds with their fingers or metal instruments, searching for bullets lodged deep in tissue. The probing often caused more damage than the bullet itself, tearing tissue and introducing infection. Then some surgeons noticed a pattern. Soldiers with bullets left in place because the surgeon couldn't find them or didn't have time to look, sometimes healed better than soldiers whose wounds were thoroughly probed. This made no sense according to medical theory, but the results were undeniable. Conservative treatment, cleaning the wound surface, applying bandages, leaving deep bullets alone, produced better survival rates than aggressive intervention. By late in the war, many surgeons had adopted this approach. They'd only remove bullets that were easily accessible. Deep bullets were left alone, becoming permanent souvenirs that soldiers would carry for the rest of their lives. The amputation height experimentation was grim but necessary. Early in the war, surgeons would amputate just above the visible injury. This left minimal stump and seemed efficient, but these amputations had terrible outcomes: high infection rates, difficult healing, stumps too short for functional prosthetics. Surgeons learned, through trial and error, that amputating higher, through healthy tissue, well above the injury, produced better results. The longer stump healed better and provided more functionality. By 1863, standard protocol was to amputate several inches above visible trauma. This meant removing more limb than strictly necessary, but it saved lives. The documentation was unprecedented in medical history. The US Surgeon General's Office commissioned a comprehensive study of all Civil War medical cases. Surgeons were required to submit detailed reports on every significant wound and treatment. These reports included patient demographics, injury descriptions, surgical procedures, outcomes, and autopsy findings when patients died. The resulting publication, The Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, filled 6 volumes and 3,000 pages. It contained 218 case histories and became required reading for military surgeons worldwide. Anesthesia protocols were developed through Civil War experience. Early in the war, dosing was completely arbitrary. By war's end, surgeons had established rough guidelines based on patient weight, wound severity, and expected surgical duration. They'd learned that chloroform worked faster, but was more dangerous. Ether was safer, but took longer and caused more nausea. They'd learned techniques for administering anesthesia safely, watching breathing patterns, checking pulse, recognizing when patients were adequately sedated versus dangerously oversedated. These protocols saved lives in future wars. Wound classification systems emerged from battlefield experience. Surgeons categorized wounds by type: gunshot, shell fragment, sabre, bayonet, and by location: extremity, thorax, abdomen, head. They tracked which combinations were survivable. Extremity wounds: high survival rate if treated quickly. Thoracic wounds, maybe 30% survival rate. Abdominal wounds, less than 10% survival rate. Head wounds with brain exposure, essentially 0 survival rate. This data helped future surgeons make triage decisions and set realistic expectations. Infection patterns were studied, even though the causes weren't understood. Surgeons noticed that certain wounds got infected more than others. Deep puncture wounds were worse than clean cuts. Summer wounds infected more than winter wounds. Wounds contaminated with clothing or dirt were worse than clean wounds. Surgeons developed protocols based on these observations: remove foreign material aggressively, keep wounds as clean as possible, perform surgery quickly before infection could establish itself. None of this addressed the root cause, bacteria, but it reduced infection rates enough to matter. The psychological aspects of trauma were documented for the first time. Surgeons described soldiers who survived physically but broke mentally, men who couldn't stop shaking, men who couldn't sleep without nightmares, men who became violent or catatonic. The term soldier's heart was coined to describe a syndrome we'd now call PTSD, characterised by rapid heartbeat, anxiety, and inability to function under stress. This recognition that trauma had psychological as well as physical components was revolutionary. Prosthetics development accelerated because of Civil War amputees. With tens of thousands of men missing limbs, demand for artificial limbs exploded. Inventors competed to create better designs. The palmer leg used rubber bumpers for shock absorption. The Anglesey leg featured a hinged knee. Artificial arms with interchangeable attachments allowed basic functionality. The government funded prosthetics research and provided vouchers for veterans, creating the modern prosthetics industry. Pain management protocols evolved through experience. Surgeons learned which patients needed morphine versus those who could manage with whiskey. They learned that severe pain actually slowed healing, that pain management wasn't just humanitarian, but medically beneficial. They developed schedules for administering pain medication. Regular small doses worked better than occasional large doses. This understanding of pain physiology was decades ahead of civilian medicine. The legacy was paradoxical. The Civil War killed 620,000 Americans, more than all other American wars combined. But it advanced military medicine by decades, maybe centuries. Techniques developed in blood-soaked tents became standard practice in hospitals worldwide. The trauma surgery protocols, created by exhausted surgeons operating by candlelight, saved millions of lives in World Wars I and II, in Korea, Vietnam, and every conflict since. The cost was astronomical, but the knowledge gained was real and lasting. The prosthetic industry, building new limbs. After the war, 45,000 Union veterans were missing at least one limb. The Confederacy had similar numbers. This created instant demand for prosthetics, spawning an entire industry. Early prosthetics were crude: a wooden peg for a leg, a hook for a hand. But inventors quickly developed more sophisticated designs. The Anglesey leg featured a hinged knee and ankle. The palmer leg used rubber components for more natural movement. Arms were harder. Artificial hands couldn't grip or feel, but inventors created devices with interchangeable attachments: a hook for work, a glove for appearance. The government provided vouchers for veterans to obtain prosthetics. This was one of the first federal benefits programs, acknowledging that the government had a responsibility to care for wounded veterans. Prosthetic makers advertised heavily, showing idealized images of veterans living normal lives with artificial limbs. The reality was less rosy. Prosthetics were uncomfortable, heavy, and prone to breaking. But they were better than nothing, and they allowed thousands of men to work, walk, and attempt to rebuild their lives. The government voucher system was remarkably progressive for 1865, the Union established a program providing up to $75 for prosthetic limbs, about $1,400 in today's money. This wasn't nearly enough for the best prosthetics, which could cost several $100s, but it covered basic models. Veterans could supplement the voucher with their own money if they wanted better quality. The Confederacy had no such program. Confederate amputees had to pay out of pocket or do without, which meant most went without because they were broke. This disparity created a visible difference between Northern and Southern veterans for decades after the war. The technology advanced rapidly, driven by market demands and government funding. The simple peg leg was replaced by articulated designs with moving joints. The Palmer leg, invented by Benjamin Palmer in 1846 but perfected during the Civil War era, used rubber tendons and springs to create a more natural walking motion. It had a hinged knee that locked when standing and flexed when walking. The foot had a flexible section that allowed it to conform to uneven ground. It wasn't perfect. It weighed about 8 pounds and made a distinctive clicking sound with each step, but it was revolutionary compared to a wooden peg. The Anglesey leg, named after Lord Anglesey, who lost his leg at Waterloo, was another popular design. It featured a wooden core covered with leather or metal, with joints at the knee and ankle. The ankle joint was particularly important because it allowed the wearer to walk on slopes and stairs without the stiff, swinging gait that marked peg leg users. Some models included cosmetic features, artificial toes, shaped calves, skin-coloured coverings, to make the prosthetic look more like a real leg under clothing. Upper limb prosthetics were more challenging because hands do complex tasks that are nearly impossible to replicate mechanically. The best solutions were simple hooks or clamps that could be opened and closed through shoulder or arm movements. A veteran could learn to use a hook with surprising dexterity, picking up objects, holding tools, even writing with practice, but they'd never grip with the strength or precision of a real hand. For cosmetic purposes, inventors created artificial hands with moulded fingers that looked realistic but didn't move. Veterans would wear the cosmetic hand in public for appearance, then switch to the functional hook for work. The fitting process was crude and often painful. There was no standardization. Each prosthetic maker had their own methods and measurements. A veteran would travel to a prosthetics shop where the maker would measure the stump, note its shape and any scarring or bone protrusions, then custom build a device. The socket, the part that attached to the stump, was usually wood or leather, padded with cotton or wool. Getting the fit right was critical because a poorly fitted socket would cause blisters, sores, and infections. Many veterans went through multiple prosthetics before finding one they could tolerate wearing for more than a few hours. The weight was a constant complaint. Even the best prosthetic leg weighed 5 to 10 pounds, which doesn't sound like much until you're trying to swing it forward. With every step, thousands of times per day. The unnatural weight distribution caused back pain, hip problems, and exhaustion. Veterans would wear their prosthetics for important occasions, but often went without at home, using crutches or just hopping because it was easier than dealing with the heavy artificial limb. Maintenance was constant. Prosthetics broke regularly, Leather straps wore out, springs snapped, wooden components cracked. Veterans living in rural areas far from prosthetics makers would attempt repairs themselves, or find local carpenters to help. This led to some creative, but not always functional modifications. Prosthetics manufacturers tried to design more durable models, but the technology of the era had limits. No material was simultaneously lightweight, strong, flexible, and affordable. The psychological aspect was significant. A prosthetic limb was a constant, visible reminder of what you'd lost. Some veterans embraced their prosthetics, grateful for any functionality. Others hated them and saw them as inadequate substitutes for real limbs. Children would sometimes be frightened by the mechanical nature of prosthetics, the clicking sounds, the stiff movements. This added social stigma to physical disability. Veterans learned to anticipate reactions, to explain their prosthetics proactively, to develop thick skin about the stairs. The advertising for prosthetics was often misleading. Companies would publish testimonials from satisfied customers, claiming they could run, jump, work full days without discomfort. Advertisements showed veterans doing impossible things, climbing ladders, riding horses, performing delicate work with their artificial limbs. These were lies or severe exaggerations designed to sell products. The reality was that most prosthetics provided basic functionality at best and were uncomfortable at all times. Despite limitations, prosthetics transformed lives. A farmer with an artificial leg could return to farming, at least partially. A clerk with an artificial hand could write and manage paperwork. These men remained disabled, but they weren't completely dependent. They could work, support families, maintain dignity. The Civil War prosthetics industry laid the groundwork for modern prosthetics technology. The research, experimentation, and manufacturing infrastructure created in the 1860s to 1880s directly led to better designs in later wars. World War I prosthetics were significantly better than Civil War prosthetics, and that improvement chain continues to today's advanced prosthetics with microprocessors and myoelectric controls. All of it traces back to the desperate need created when 90,000 young men came home missing limbs and demanded the technology to rebuild their lives. Post-war life, the veterans' struggle. Veterans returned home changed. Those who'd lost limbs faced obvious challenges, but even those who looked intact often carried invisible wounds. They'd seen friends die, had survived things that should have killed them, and carried memories they couldn't erase. Many couldn't work their previous jobs. A farmer missing a leg couldn't plough fields. A carpenter missing an arm couldn't swing a hammer. They'd apply for veterans' pensions, which required proving their disability was war-related and navigating bureaucracy that often took years. Communities didn't always welcome them back warmly. War veterans were reminders of death and suffering. Some people crossed the street to avoid them. Others stared uncomfortably at missing limbs. Veterans formed their own communities, organisations, like the Grand Army of the Republic, where they could be around others who understood. They'd meet regularly, share stories, support each other through hard times. Many turned to alcohol. Many suffered from what we'd now call PTSD. Nightmares, flashbacks, inability to hold jobs or maintain relationships. There was no treatment, no therapy, no understanding of what was wrong with them. The pension application process was deliberately difficult. The government was concerned about fraud, able-bodied men pretending to be disabled to collect benefits. So they created a system requiring extensive documentation. You needed medical records proving your injury occurred during service. You needed witness statements from fellow soldiers or officers. You needed examination by pension board physicians who'd verify your disability. Many veterans had no documentation because field hospital records were lost or never properly filed. Some had been treated by surgeons who died or moved away and couldn't be located to provide statements. The burden of proof fell entirely on the veteran, and many gave up after years of rejection letters and bureaucratic runarounds. Even successful applications took time. A veteran might file in 1865 and not receive his first pension payment until 1868 or later. During those years, he'd have no income if he couldn't work, relying on family charity or community support that often wasn't forthcoming. The initial pension amounts were small, $8 per month for total disability, less for partial disabilities. This wasn't enough to live on, but it helped. Over time, pension amounts increased and eligibility expanded. But the initial post-war years were brutal for disabled veterans waiting for benefits that might never arrive. The employment problem was severe and underestimated. Skilled trades required full use of your body. A blacksmith needed 2 strong arms. A cooper needed to bend and lift barrels. A logger needed legs that could navigate rough terrain all day. Veterans with missing limbs found themselves unemployable in their previous professions. Some retrained for sedentary work, clerking, accounting, teaching, if they had the education for it. Many didn't. They'd been farmers or labourers with minimal schooling. They ended up in menial jobs that paid barely enough to survive. A dramatic fall in status and income from their pre-war lives. The psychological wounds were worse because they were invisible and misunderstood. A veteran would wake screaming from nightmares about battles. He'd flinch at loud noises. He'd become violent without provocation, his mind temporarily back in combat. He'd drink to numb the memories and the fear. Families didn't understand. The war's over, they'd say. Why can't you just move on? But the war wasn't over for the veteran. It replayed in his head constantly. He'd see the faces of men he'd killed. He'd hear the screams from the surgical tent. He'd smell gangrene when no gangrene was present. This was called soldier's heart, or nostalgia, if it was acknowledged at all. Most people thought the veteran was weak or crazy or making excuses. The social isolation was profound. Veterans tried to explain their experiences to people who hadn't been there, and the gap was unbridgeable. How do you explain to your wife that you can't sleep in a closed room because it reminds you of the surgical tent? How do you tell your children why you can't attend 4th of July celebrations? Because fireworks trigger panic. Civilians didn't want to hear about the war anyway. They'd had 4 years of worry and loss. Now they wanted to move forward, rebuild, forget. Veterans were stuck in the past, unable to forget, and the communities resented them for it. The Grand Army of the Republic and similar veterans organisations provided crucial support. Here, veterans could talk honestly about their experiences without judgment. They'd share stories in ways they couldn't with civilians, the humour, the horror, the camaraderie, the loss. They'd help each other navigate the pension system, find jobs, get medical care. They'd attend funerals when brother veterans died, ensuring at least someone honoured their service. These organisations became surrogate families for men whose actual families didn't understand them anymore. The alcohol problem was epidemic. Estimates suggest 40 to 50% of Civil War veterans developed serious drinking problems. Alcohol temporarily silenced the memories, dulled the physical pain from wounds and amputations, and made social situations tolerable. Many veterans were functional alcoholics, holding jobs and families together while drinking heavily every evening. Others descended into complete addiction, losing jobs, families, and eventually lives to drink. The temperance movement of the late 1800s specifically targeted veterans as cautionary examples, which added moral judgment to men already struggling with trauma. Marriages often failed. Veterans returned home to wives who'd been managing alone for years and had adapted to independence. The veteran expected to resume his role as head of household, but couldn't because he was physically or psychologically incapable. Conflicts arose. Some wives couldn't handle their husband's nightmares, violence, or drinking. Divorce was difficult and socially stigmatized. So many couples stayed together miserably. Children grew up with traumatized fathers who couldn't show affection, couldn't maintain steady employment, and sometimes became abusive when triggered by PTSD symptoms they didn't understand. Confederate veterans faced additional challenges. The South was economically devastated. Jobs were scarce. The Confederate government ceased to exist, so there were no pensions or benefits. Southern veterans relied entirely on state governments, most of which were broke, or on private charity. Many Confederate veterans lived in poverty for decades, unable to work due to disabilities, unable to get help because no system existed to provide it. Some migrated west, seeking fresh starts. Others just endured, barely surviving. The suicide rate among Civil War veterans was high, though exact statistics don't exist because suicide was often covered up by families. Veterans would accidentally shoot themselves while cleaning guns, or accidentally overdose on morphine, or simply disappear and be found dead weeks later. These deaths were usually recorded as accidents or natural causes to avoid the stigma and religious complications of suicide. But everyone knew what had actually happened. The physical health problems compounded over time. Amputation stumps developed chronic pain and infections. Old wounds that had healed initially would break down years later. Lead poisoning from bullets still lodged in bodies caused progressive symptoms, chronic diseases contracted during service, malaria, dysentery, lung damage from pneumonia, shortened lifespans significantly. Many Civil War veterans died in their 40s or 50s from complications of war wounds and diseases, technically dying decades after the war, but really killed by it. Medical advances, the silver lining. If there's anything positive to say about Civil War medicine, it's that it accelerated medical progress dramatically. The sheer volume of casualties forced innovation. Surgeons learned more about human anatomy in 4 years of war than in decades of peacetime practice. The war proved the value of anesthesia. Skeptical surgeons who'd initially avoided it saw that patients recovered better when they didn't experience surgery while conscious. Post-war, anesthesia became standard practice. The war demonstrated the importance of sanitation, even if surgeons didn't fully understand why. Hospitals that maintained cleaner conditions had better outcomes. This planted seeds for acceptance of germ theory. The development of ambulance systems, triage protocols, and battlefield medicine would save lives in every future conflict. World War I doctors built directly on Civil War knowledge. Modern trauma surgery traces its lineage directly back to these men working in blood-soaked tents. The anatomical knowledge gained was unprecedented. Civilian surgeons might perform a dozen major surgeries per year. Civil War surgeons performed thousands. They saw every possible variation of human anatomy, every type of wound, every complication. They learned which blood vessels were where, which organs could sustain damage, and which couldn't, how bones fractured under different forces. This practical anatomical knowledge, documented in thousands of case reports, became the foundation for surgical textbooks used for the next 50 years. Medical students in 1900 were learning anatomy from cases documented at Gettysburg and Antietam. Anesthesia acceptance was perhaps the war's most important medical legacy. Before the war, maybe half of surgeons used anesthesia regularly. After the war, nearly all did. The evidence was overwhelming. Patients who underwent surgery under anesthesia had better outcomes. They experienced less shock, recovered faster, and had lower mortality rates. Even surgeons who'd initially rejected anesthesia as dangerous or unnecessary became converts after seeing the results. Post-war surgical anesthesia became standard practice in American and European hospitals. The techniques refined during the war, dosing protocols, administration methods, patient monitoring, directly improved civilian surgical care. The sanitation observations were crucial, even though they weren't fully understood. Some surgeons noticed that hospitals with better ventilation had lower infection rates. Others noticed that cleaning surgical instruments between patients seemed to help. A few noticed that washing hands reduced infection spread. These observations didn't prove germ theory. Most surgeons still believed in miasma, but they created practical protocols that worked. When Joseph Lister published his antiseptic surgery techniques in 1867, based on Pasteur's germ theory, American surgeons who'd served in the Civil War were more receptive because they had already seen that cleanliness mattered, even if they didn't know why. The triage system developed during the war became the global standard for mass casualty situations. The three-category system, immediate, delayed, expectant, was adopted by European militaries, then by civilian emergency medicine. Some modern emergency rooms still use triage principles developed by overwhelmed Civil War surgeons, trying to save as many lives as possible with limited resources. The colour-coded triage tags used today, red, yellow, green, black, directly descend from Civil War triage marks, made with charcoal on foreheads. The ambulance system became a template for emergency medical services. The organised corps, with trained drivers, standardised vehicles, and efficient evacuation procedures, proved far superior to the chaos of early war casualty retrieval. European nations studied the Union Ambulance Corps and adopted similar systems. Civilian cities began creating ambulance services based on military models. The first civilian ambulance service in the United States was established in Cincinnati in 1865. directly copying military ambulance protocols, battlefield medicine protocols. The systematic approach to treating combat casualties were codified in military medical manuals that remained in use through World War I. The procedures for treating specific wound types, the timing of interventions, the decision trees for amputation versus conservation, all of this institutional knowledge saved lives in future wars. When American soldiers were wounded in France in 1918, they were treated using protocols refined at Gettysburg. The prosthetics industry and rehabilitation medicine emerged from Civil War necessity. Before the war, prosthetics were rare and crude. After the war, they were manufactured at scale with government support. The research into designing better prosthetics, the biomechanics of walking with artificial limbs, the psychological aspects of limb loss, all of this became formalised fields of medical study because of Civil War amputees. Modern prosthetics engineering traces directly back to this period. Medical record keeping improved dramatically. The detailed documentation required by the Surgeon General's office created the first comprehensive medical database. This established the principle that medical data should be systematically collected and analysed. Modern electronic medical records, evidence-based medicine, and outcome tracking all descend from this innovation. The idea that medical knowledge should be based on documented cases rather than tradition or theory was revolutionary and permanent. Pain management research advanced because of the war's demand for effective painkillers. The study of morphine dosing, addiction risks and pain physiology accelerated dramatically. Post-war, this knowledge improved civilian pain management for surgery, chronic pain, and end-of-life care. The recognition that pain itself was harmful and worth treating aggressively became medical consensus partly because of Civil War experience. Psychiatric medicine made its first faltering steps toward recognising psychological trauma as a legitimate medical condition. Soldiers' heart was documented, studied and treated, however inadequately. This planted seeds for later understanding of PTSD and trauma psychology. The recognition that war experiences could cause lasting psychological damage that deserved medical attention rather than moral judgment was revolutionary for the 1860s. Medical education reform was driven partly by Civil War experiences. Many doctors returned from the war appalled at the lack of training they and their colleagues had received. They pushed for longer medical school programs, more rigorous training, clinical experience requirements, and licensing standards. The American Medical Association, founded in 1847, gained power and influence after the war, largely through reform efforts led by veteran doctors who'd seen the consequences of poor medical training. The legacy was contradictory and uncomfortable. The Civil War was a medical catastrophe that killed hundreds of thousands through disease and infection that should have been preventable. But it also accelerated medical progress in ways that saved millions of lives in subsequent generations. This doesn't justify the suffering. Nothing justifies 620,000 dead Americans. But it means their suffering wasn't entirely meaningless. The knowledge gained, purchased at terrible cost, genuinely advanced human medical knowledge and reduced suffering in future conflicts. That's the only silver lining to be found in 4 years of medical horror, and whether it's adequate consolation depends entirely on who you ask and when they died. Legacy. Remembering the surgeons. Civil War surgeons don't get monuments. There's no memorial to the men who worked 72-hour shifts trying to save limbs and lives. History remembers. The generals, the presidents, the dramatic battles. The surgeons are footnotes. But they were there for every wounded soldier. They were the last hope when everything else had failed. They worked themselves to exhaustion, destroyed their mental health, and ruined their clothes with blood that would never wash out. Some were incompetent, some were brilliant, most were somewhere in between. Ordinary men asked to perform extraordinary tasks with insufficient tools and training. They saved lives when they could. They eased suffering when they couldn't save lives. They bore witness to the true cost of war, not the strategic decisions, not the political debates, but the human bodies broken and bleeding. The young men crying for their mothers. The impossible choices about who gets surgery and who gets morphine and who gets nothing but a blanket and a prayer. Tonight, as you drift off in your comfortable bed, spare a thought for those surgeons, for the men who stood ankle deep in blood, sawing through bone, trying to save one more soldier before the next battle brought hundreds more. When we visit Civil War battlefields today, we see monuments to regiments, to generals, to famous charges and defensive stands. We read plaques explaining troop movements and tactical decisions. The field hospitals are rarely marked. The spots where thousands of amputations occurred are unmarked patches of grass. The mass graves, containing piles of severed limbs, have been forgotten, their locations lost to time. History has chosen to remember glory and forget gore. This is understandable. Glory is more comfortable to commemorate, but it's incomplete. The battlefield is half the story. The surgical tent is the other half. The surgeons themselves rarely talked about their war experiences after it ended. Some wrote memoirs, usually clinical and detached, focusing on medical techniques rather than emotional experiences. Others never spoke of it at all, carrying their memories silently until they died. Their families often had no idea what they'd endured. A surgeon's son might know his father had served in the war, but wouldn't know about the 40 amputations in a single day, the screaming patients, the infections that killed men the surgeon had worked desperately to save. This silence meant their experiences died with them, preserved only in fragmentary written records that historians would discover decades later. The few monuments that exist to Civil War medical personnel are modest. Small markers at old hospital sites, plaques honouring specific surgeons who made significant contributions, nothing approaching the grand monuments to military leaders. This reflects a cultural prioritisation of combat heroism over medical service. A general who ordered men to their deaths gets a statue. A surgeon who saved hundreds of lives gets forgotten. Both were essential to the war effort, but only one fits our narrative of what heroism looks like. Some surgeons achieved recognition through their post-war careers. They became prominent physicians, medical school professors, or public health officials. Their Civil War service was noted as a biographical detail, but not the defining feature of their lives. Others disappeared into obscurity, returning to small-town practices or leaving medicine entirely. A surgeon who'd performed thousands of operations during the war, might spend his remaining decades delivering babies and treating fevers in rural Pennsylvania. His wartime experience is irrelevant to his daily work and unknown to his patients. The emotional cost to surgeons has been largely ignored by history. We have casualty figures for soldiers: 620,000 dead, hundreds of thousands wounded. We don't have figures for how many surgeons developed PTSD, alcoholism, or depression. We don't know how many committed suicide. We don't know how many marriages failed because a surgeon came home psychologically destroyed. These invisible casualties don't appear in history books because nobody tracked them. Mental health wasn't considered a legitimate medical concern. A surgeon who broke down was considered weak, not wounded. The competence question haunts their legacy. Were Civil War surgeons butchers who killed patients through ignorance? Or were they dedicated professionals doing their best with limited resources? The answer is both. Some surgeons were genuinely incompetent. Diploma mill graduates who shouldn't have been operating on anyone. Others were highly skilled and would have excelled in any era. Most were adequate. Decent doctors who made mistakes under pressure, but saved more lives than they cost. Judging them by modern standards is unfair. They operated without antibiotics, without proper anesthesia, without understanding of germ theory, under battlefield conditions that would overwhelm modern trauma surgeons. That any patient survived is remarkable. The technological limitations excuse some failures, but not all. Even given primitive tools, some surgeons were more careful, more thoughtful, more willing to question standard procedures than others. The surgeons who experimented with leaving bullets in place saved lives. The surgeons who maintained cleaner surgical conditions saved lives. The surgeons who took time to ligate every blood vessel properly saved lives. Individual choices mattered, even in terrible conditions. Some surgeons made consistently better choices than others, and that deserves recognition. The documentation they left behind is their truest monument. The thousands of case reports filed with the Surgeon General's office, the personal letters describing wounds and treatments, the medical journal articles analysing outcomes. This written record preserved their experiences and became the foundation for future medical advances. Every modern trauma surgeon who successfully treats a blast injury or performs a life-saving amputation is building on knowledge first documented by Civil War surgeons. That's a meaningful legacy, even if it lacks the physical permanence of bronze and marble. The individual stories are what make them human. The surgeon who performed his first amputation on his first day in a field hospital and somehow didn't kill the patient. The surgeon who worked 48 hours straight at Gettysburg, then collapsed and slept for 20 hours. The surgeon who wrote letters to families of dead soldiers every night, trying to provide comfort. The surgeon who kept a blood-soaked apron for 50 years as a reminder. The surgeon who quit medicine entirely after the war, unable to continue in a profession that reminded him of trauma. These individual experiences don't fit neatly into historical narratives about the war's causes or outcomes, but they reveal the human reality behind the statistics. Their legacy is complicated and uncomfortable. They participated in a system that caused tremendous suffering, war itself. They failed to prevent most deaths because their medical knowledge was insufficient. They made mistakes that killed people, but they also saved tens of thousands of lives that would otherwise have been lost. They advanced medical knowledge in ways that benefit humanity still. They bore witness to suffering and tried, within their limitations, to reduce it. That's not heroic in the conventional sense, but it's not nothing either. As you fall asleep tonight, comfortable and safe, remember that modern medicine, the surgery that can save you from traumatic injuries, the anesthesia that spares you pain, the antibiotics that prevent infection. All of this was built partly on knowledge gained by men standing in blood-soaked tents during America's bloodiest war. Their suffering and their patients' suffering purchased knowledge that saves lives today. It's an uncomfortable transaction, but it's real. They deserve to be remembered, not as heroes or villains, but as humans who did impossible work under impossible conditions and somehow moved medicine forward through sheer desperate necessity